Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another scary story. Your place where we uncover the darkest mysteries in a calming and reflective way. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. Now get comfortable and relax. I still remember the first time I heard the crying. It was a quiet night, the kind where you can almost hear your own thoughts, the kind where the air feels thick with the weight of the silence. I was just a kid, maybe 8 years old, and I remember being wide awake staring at the dark ceiling of my room. My brother Jake was in his room down the hall, probably doing homework or playing video games, but I always found it hard to sleep alone. It wasn't that I was scared. I didn't know what fear was, not like this. But then I heard it. At first I thought it was just the sound of the wind or maybe a neighbor's dog whining in the distance. But as I lay there, straining my ears to the sounds of the night, I realized it wasn't either of those things. It was soft, pitiful, almost pleading. It was the sound of a little girl crying. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My bedroom door was cracked open and I could hear the sound coming from somewhere, near but not close enough for me to understand where it was coming from. I didn't know what to do. My mother was working her night shift at the hospital, and Jake was never around when I needed him. So I gathered the courage to leave my bed and walk toward the hallway. The crying grew louder, more distinct, and my stomach twisted into knots. The sound was coming from my own room, my own corner. My body tensed, and I didn't know what I was afraid of, but I was. I was terrified, and yet I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. When I reached the corner, I saw her. The little girl was crouched there in a torn nightgown, her face buried in her hands, shaking with each sob. My heart broke for her, and instinctively I reached out a hand. "Hey," I whispered, my voice barely a murmur. "Are you okay?" The girl's head snapped up and I froze. Her face wasn't like any child's face I had ever seen. Her skin was pale, too pale. Her eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were black voids. There was nothing there, just emptiness staring back at me. I recoiled, stumbling backward in fear. I blinked, and she was gone. Vanished, like she had never been there. I bolted for the door, my breath shallow, my heart racing in panic. I ran, straight to Jake's room, pounding on his door. When he opened it, I was shaking. "Jake, there's a girl in my room," I gasped, but he just frowned, rubbing his eyes. "It's just a nightmare, Mia. Go back to bed." But I knew what I had seen. I didn't understand it, but I knew it wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. The next few nights I kept hearing the crying, the soft weeping in the dark, just out of sight. I couldn't make it stop. My mother dismissed it, blaming my overactive imagination. But when Jake started hearing it too, we couldn't ignore it anymore. We both knew something was in the house with us, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And I think deep down, we both knew that whatever it wasn't done with us yet. Jake always made fun of me for being scared of the basement. It was a running joke between us. He'd pretend to be a ghost, jumping out from the shadows, and I'd scream, running up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me. But the truth was, the basement wasn't like other basements. It had an air about it, something off-kilter that never quite sat right with me. Even when I was younger, I could feel it. The dampness in the air, the musty smell of wet concrete, the way the shadows seemed to curl and twist, as though they were alive. Jake wasn't as bothered by it. He had always been more skeptical than I was, brushing off my feelings as nonsense. But that all changed the night he went down there alone. It started like any other evening. Mom was working and it was just me and Jake at home. He'd promised me he was just going to grab a few things from the basement and be back in no time. I'd heard him clattering around down there, so I thought nothing of it. But after a few minutes, the noises stopped. And then, from the deep, gurgling silence of the basement, I heard something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't a noise I recognized. It was a whisper, wet and slithering, like someone was speaking from inside the walls. I stood frozen, the floor cold beneath my bare feet. The gurgling sound grew louder, like water being sucked down a drain, and then I heard it. A hiss. A word. Run. The voice was too close. My heart leaped into my throat. I had to do something. I called down the stairs, but there was no answer. Just the echoing whisper of something inhuman. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, half expecting to see Jake standing there with his usual grin, ready to laugh at me for being so jumpy. But he wasn't there. Instead, I heard footsteps above me. I turned quickly, and there he was, Jake, pale and wide-eyed, standing at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing. His voice trembled when he spoke. "Mia, I'm not going back down there. Ever." He slammed the door shut behind him, and for the rest of that night we stayed as far from the basement as we could. The next day we padlocked the door. We never spoke of what had happened, but I knew. Something in that basement was alive. Something that wanted us to leave. The stormy October night is one I will never forget. It was the final straw that broke us. The rain hammered against the windows like the house itself was being attacked. The wind howling through the cracks in the walls. It was the kind of night where everything felt wrong. It had been weeks since Jake and I had been on edge. But tonight, something in the house felt more oppressive than usual. Mom had just gotten back from her night shift, her tired eyes barely registering as she walked through the door. She didn't notice how thick the air felt, how the house seemed to hum with energy. She was too exhausted to feel the weight of the house on her shoulders, but I felt it. The presence that had been growing in the corners, in the shadows, was closing in on us. That night she went to the hall closet to pull out some blankets. It wasn't anything unusual. It was just another mundane task to keep the house functional. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book, trying to distract myself from the noise outside. Jake was upstairs in his room, avoiding whatever was lurking below as usual. But then, it happened. A loud crash split the air. I shot up from the couch, heart racing, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. I bolted toward the hallway, and that's when I saw it. The closet door, our sliding closet door, was on the floor lying next to my mom, who was crumpled on the ground. Her head was bleeding, the blood already soaking into her hair, staining her pale face. "Mom!" I screamed, rushing to her side, shaking her awake. Her eyes fluttered open, but she didn't seem to register what had happened. "I'm okay, Mia," she murmured, her voice slurred as she tried to sit up, still dazed. But I could see the pain in her eyes and the confusion on her face. The closet door had fallen off its tracks, but it wasn't just a fall. It was like it had been thrown with force. The way it had hit her head, knocking her unconscious, felt deliberate. I tried to help her up, but she slumped back against the wall, too weak to stand. My breath caught in my throat. The door, now propped back into place like it had been carefully set there, looked so innocent, so normal. But I knew that wasn't an accident. Jake came rushing down the stairs, his face pale as he saw Mom. "What the hell happened?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But I saw it. The closet. It attacked her. It wasn't just a door falling off. It was like it was trying to hurt her." Mom shook her head, her eyes foggy. "It's just the storm, Mia. I must have knocked it over when I opened it." But we all knew better. We had seen too much already. That was the moment when we knew we couldn't stay any longer. The house had been slowly breaking us down, piece by piece, and now it was taking action. Whatever had been watching us from the corners of the rooms, whatever had been hiding in the walls, had finally made its move. It had hurt Mom, and it had gotten too close. We packed up in a hurry the next day, not saying a word. We didn't know where we were going, but we knew we had to leave. It was over. Whatever haunted Raven's End had claimed too much of us already. As we walked out, the house loomed behind us, silent and waiting. It knew, and we knew that it wasn't finished. The curse that had followed us through the hallways and into our nightmares was still there, still waiting for someone new to walk through its doors. Years passed since we left Ravensend, but the scars of that place never faded. Life moved on in its own way. I finished school, started working, and did my best to forget about the house that had haunted my childhood. But some things just don't fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the echoes of the crying. "Girl," feel the oppressive air of the basement and see the closet door coming at my mom with a force I couldn't explain. There were moments when I thought I had moved on, but then the memories would come rushing back, dark and vivid. One afternoon, curiosity gnawed at me. I had never returned to Blackthorn, but there I was, standing at the corner of the street, looking at the row of townhouses from across the road. Ravensend, Unit 13. It stood like a scar on the landscape, its once pristine white paint now chipped and weathered, the windows boarded up, as if it was trying to shut out the memories of everything that had happened there. I was hesitant, at first, but the pull to go back to understand what had truly happened there was too strong to ignore. The new owners had moved in. I knew that much from a neighbor who worked at the local diner. They'd only been there for a few weeks. I couldn't stop myself from walking up the path toward the building. When I reached the front door, I hesitated for a moment, standing there in the cool autumn air, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But then the realtor appeared from behind the house, her face pale, clearly anxious. "You're the Sullivan girl, right?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. I nodded, my heart hammering. "The last family, they moved out. Said they couldn't stay. Something about their daughter." "Something about their daughter?" I asked, the words coming out more urgently than I meant. The realtor looked around nervously, as if she were afraid someone might be listening. "Their little girl kept screaming about the woman in her closet. I don't know the details, but they said she wouldn't go near it. They said it was her mother or something pretending to be her mother. The last night, she was hysterical, begging them not to make her go back to the room. They left the next day, and we haven't heard from them since." A cold chill ran down my spine. My blood turned to ice. The woman in the closet. I had never told anyone about what I'd seen. The shadowy figure behind the crying girl, the one who reached out from the closet to grab her. I had kept that secret all these years, not understanding it, not knowing how to explain it. But now, standing there in front of the townhouse, it all made sense. The house hadn't just been tormenting us. It had been after her. The little girl, the woman in the closet, had been the one controlling everything. She had been there, pulling the strings, twisting the minds of anyone who walked through the door. I stepped back, my legs shaking, a chill creeping up my spine. As I turned to leave, I glanced at the window of Unit 13, and there, in the dim light, I could have sworn I saw it, the flicker of a light turning on in the closet. And then, I heard it. The faint, distant sound of a child crying. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my breath ragged and sharp in my chest. My heart hammered against my ribcage like it was trying to break free, but I couldn't make myself stop. I didn't care if I looked crazy, if anyone was watching me. All I could hear was the sound of that faint, distant crying and the sick realization that the house had never truly let me go. When I reached the end of the street, I paused, hands on my knees, gasping for air. I looked back toward Ravensend, the townhouses looming in the distance like silent sentinels. The houses were just as still and oppressive as they had been when I was a child. The fog was rolling in thick now, wrapping everything in a ghostly shroud. But I couldn't stop thinking about what the realtor had told me. The woman in the closet. I had never spoken a word about the shadowy figure I'd seen in my room all those years ago. The figure who seemed to reach out from the closet to claim the sobbing girl. I had buried it deep, convinced that it was just a bad memory, a trick of my young mind. But now I wasn't so sure. The house had been trying to tell me something all along, showing me things I wasn't ready to understand. And it wasn't finished yet. I turned to face the townhouse again, feeling a cold dread crawl up my spine. The air was heavier now, as if the house was beckoning me back. I shook my head, trying to force the fear away, but it wouldn't let go. There was no sense in going back. It had been years and the house was no longer our problem. But something deep inside me told me that whatever was left behind in that place still wanted me. The crying stopped abruptly. Suddenly, I found myself walking back toward the townhouse, my steps slow, as if some invisible force was pulling me. My hand trembled as I reached for the door. I knew it was wrong. I knew I should turn around, leave it all behind. But the curiosity, the need to understand, the horrors we had suffered was overpowering. It was as if the house was asking me to confront it one last time. I stood there for a moment, staring at the old door, and then, just as I was about to reach for the knob, a bright flash of light erupted from the window. The closet light. It flickered on, casting an eerie glow through the broken blinds. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I ran with everything I had, ignoring the weight of the past, the presence that haunted me, the warning I had always felt. I couldn't go back there. Not for answers. Not for closure. As I sprinted toward the safety of the street corner, I glanced, back one last time at Raven's End. The light in the closet went dark, and I knew for certain that whatever haunted that place, whatever it was, would never let anyone leave, no matter how many years passed. The house would always watch, always wait for someone new to walk through its cursed doors. And as I disappeared into the night, I could hear it faintly, just behind me, soft weeping in the wind. I'd always been a bit of an outsider. It wasn't so much that I didn't fit in, I just never really tried. When I transferred to Blackwood Academy in the fall of 1994, I wasn't expecting to make friends or be welcomed with open arms. It was an all-boys school, nestled deep in the Adirondack Mountains, far away from the noise of the world. From the moment I stepped onto the campus, I could feel the weight of its history pressing down on me, a thick, almost palpable air that seemed to hang between the old brick walls. The school had been built in 1892, and it showed. The towering Gothic structures were weathered by time and seemed to sag under the burden of decades of secrets. The smell of old parchment and damp stone was everywhere. It clung to your clothes, your skin, even your thoughts. When I walked down, the hallways, flickering gas lamps cast long shadows that reached out, grasping at my legs, pulling me deeper into the school's twisted embrace. The place had a reputation, one that my father had warned me about when he sent me here. Don't believe the stories, he'd said with a tired laugh. They're just stories. But even I could tell he was trying to convince himself. When I first arrived, I didn't know much about Blackwood's past, but the whispers started almost immediately. You could hear them in the corridors, in the dining hall, in the locked bathrooms no one ever dared use. They spoke of the mistress, the ghost of headmistress Eleanor Voss, who had hanged herself in the bell tower after a scandal involving the disappearance of 3 students back in 1913. It was said that her spirit never left the school, that she wandered the halls watching for boys who strayed too far from the rules. I didn't buy it at first. Ghost stories were the stuff of idle chatter and campfire tales. But something about Blackwood Academy felt different. Something in the air, the way the light seemed to shift in the hallways, made it impossible to ignore. The place felt alive, in a way I couldn't explain. And it wasn't long before I realized the stories weren't just that. They were warnings. My first few days passed in a haze of orientation and lectures, the monotony of school life keeping me distracted from the creeping sense of unease that followed me everywhere. I could tell most of the other students were on edge too. They never said anything directly, but I could see it in the way they moved, the way they kept their heads low when passing the bell tower, or the way their gazes darted around corners, as if they expected someone or something to be watching. It was as if we were all bound by an unspoken rule. Don't acknowledge the past. Don't talk about her. That was until one stormy night in October. I'd stayed late in the 3rd floor, library, trying to cram for my upcoming exams. The wind howled outside, rattling the lead glass windows in their frames. I'd been alone for a while, save for the occasional shuffle of students passing by. But the longer I sat there, the more the oppressive atmosphere of the school started to settle over me. It wasn't just the storm, it was something in the air. The temperature seemed to drop with every passing minute, and the dim gas lamps flickered sporadically, casting long, jittery shadows across the room. It felt like the walls themselves were listening. I was hunched over a textbook trying to focus when the temperature dropped again, sharp and sudden. An icy gust of wind rushed through the room, though the windows were sealed tight. I froze, heart hammering in my chest as I scanned the room for any sign of movement. Nothing. But then I heard it. A thud, and then another. Books began launching, themselves off the shelves with a violent thump, landing on the floor in a disorganized mess. The sound echoed through the library like a thunderclap. I jerked back in my seat, narrowly avoiding the heavy volume that came flying toward me, missing my head by mere inches. My stomach lurched and I pushed myself up from the desk, my legs shaky as I stumbled toward the door. But before I could reach it, I saw her, a figure near the antique globe in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing tricks on me. But when I blinked, she was still there. A pale woman in a high-collared, black dress. Her features were obscured by a veil of shadows, and her fingers, long, almost skeletal, traced the spines of the books on the shelf. The air around her seemed to hum with a cold energy that froze my blood in my veins. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at her, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The room fell silent. The books had stopped flying. The wind had stopped howling outside. The only sound was the rapid pounding of my heart in my ears. But I could still smell it, the scent of lavender and grave dirt, faint but unmistakable. It lingered in the air, clinging to the edges of my senses. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of the woman's return. But when I finally regained my senses enough to move, I bolted for the door, my feet stumbling over the slick wooden floor. The next morning, I confronted Headmaster Graves, hoping for some explanation. But when I described what had happened, his face paled. "That's Eleanor," he muttered, loosening his tie as if the very mention of her name caused him physical discomfort. "She doesn't like boys who break the rules." The last student, who saw her clearly, well, he was found catatonic in the bell tower, whispering something about the lessons never ending. He left it at that, but I could see the fear in his eyes. And that's when it hit me. The stories weren't just stories. Eleanor Voss, the mistress, was real, and she was waiting for us. After the incident in the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just the lingering smell of lavender and grave dirt that clung to the air. It wasn't even the way my pulse still raced every time I thought about the woman in the black dress, her skeletal fingers tracing the books on the shelf. What unsettled me the most was the overwhelming presence that seemed to follow me after that night. It was like I wasn't alone even when I was. The school had always been eerie, but now it felt as though the walls themselves were breathing, watching me. Every creak of the old floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, felt like an invitation to something darker. I began to question everything, the strange occurrences that I had dismissed as coincidence, the heavy silence that hung over the campus like a cloud. It was as if the entire school had been built over a hidden history, a history that none of us were meant to uncover. I kept my head down the following days, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. I focused on my studies, kept to myself, and stayed away from the third-floor library. But the more I tried to distance myself from whatever was happening, the more the school seemed to draw me in. It wasn't just the library. It was everywhere. At night, when I lay in my dorm bed, I could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing down the hall, though no one was ever there when I looked. The low, rhythmic tapping of a ruler would drift from the classrooms, a constant reminder that someone or something was still teaching lessons that never ended. I wasn't the only one feeling the change. The other boys in my dorm were on edge, their eyes wide and constantly shifting, like prey aware of a predator nearby. They'd become distant, avoiding each other, speaking in hushed tones whenever they did interact. And then there were the whispers, quiet, almost imperceptible, but always there. I could hear them in the dark corners of the dorm, the low murmurs that seemed to speak in a language I couldn't understand. But what chilled me the most was the way those whispers stopped when I walked by, as if they were waiting for me to leave before continuing. And then, 2 weeks after my encounter with the ghost in the library had happened, I woke up in the middle of the night to a soft, insistent tapping at my window. At first I thought it was just the wind, the branches of a tree scraping against the glass, but when I got out of bed and walked over to the window, I saw something I couldn't explain. There, on the other side of the glass, stood a figure, a woman in a high-collared black dress, her face obscured by a veil of shadows. She stood completely still, staring directly at me, her hands resting at her sides. My heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. After all, I had barely slept in days, and the school's oppressive atmosphere could play tricks on the mind, but no. She was there, just outside, unmoving, like a statue. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It was like a signal, a message I couldn't decipher. I backed away from the window, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But just as quickly as she had appeared, the figure vanished, gone. No trace of her, no footsteps in the snow outside, just the soft, cold night air. The next morning I tried to convince myself that it had been some sort of trick of the light, or perhaps I had imagined the whole thing. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. And that's when I started to notice the changes in my classmates. The ones who had once laughed and joked in the hallways now walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Some of them even looked sick, pale and drawn, as though the life had been drained from them. One afternoon, I found myself in the dining hall, sitting alone at a corner table. I was halfway through my meal when I overheard a conversation between 2 boys from the dorm. They were whispering, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. I heard something, one of them said, his voice barely a whisper. Last night, in the bell tower, it wasn't just the wind. I heard footsteps, like someone was pacing up there. But no one was in there. The other boy glanced nervously toward the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. You're not the only one. I heard something too. But you didn't hear about the last one, right? The last one? The first boy asked. Yeah, the second boy whispered, his voice trembling. The kid who saw her. The one who saw Eleanor in the bell tower. They found him up there a few days later. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't seeing anything. He was talking about her lessons. They said he was never the same after that. My stomach twisted in knots. I didn't need to hear anymore. The stories weren't just rumors, they were warnings. Warnings that had been passed down for decades. Warnings I had ignored, convinced I was safe. But I wasn't. None of us were. The bell tower loomed over the campus, a constant reminder of the school's dark history. It felt like the epicenter of the school's curse, the place where everything began, and where it would all come to an end. And now it seemed like the mistress was coming for me. That night I lay in bed wide awake, staring up at the ceiling, hearing nothing but the wind and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. But as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I heard something I couldn't ignore. A voice. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. It whispered my name. Ethan. I jerked upright, my heart racing in my chest. There, in the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was the same figure I'd seen at the window, the mistress. But this time, she wasn't outside. She was inside. I had never felt more awake, or more afraid, than in that moment. The figure, in the corner of my room, standing motionless in the shadows, was no longer a vague presence. It was real as the chill that crawled up my spine. Her long skeletal fingers hung limply by her side. her body wrapped in a black dress that seemed to blend with the dark, oppressive atmosphere of the room. It was as if she had always been there, waiting, watching. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were filled with lead. My heart was thumping in my chest so loudly I thought it might explode. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, constricted by fear, and my body wouldn't respond to the primal instinct to flee. Instead, I sat frozen, my eyes locked onto her as if somehow staring at her would make her disappear. But she didn't move. She just stood there, staring back at me with those empty eyes. No, not empty. There was something in them. Something that made my blood run cold. A hunger, an emptiness, a call. It was as if she wasn't just looking at me. She was looking through me. She wasn't human, at least not anymore. I forced myself to blink, to break the trance. The instant I did, the air shifted, like someone had flipped a switch. The room felt colder, the shadows deepened, and the oppressive silence grew louder, somehow more suffocating. I looked away, unable to maintain eye contact, but the unease in my chest only deepened. I need to leave. Now. But just as I made the decision to bolt from my bed, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was a whisper, low and broken, like a breeze pushing through the cracks in the walls. "Stay," the voice breathed. The word echoed in my mind, more chilling than any scream. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I clutched the blankets tighter, my legs frozen beneath them. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to listen. My hands were clammy, slick with sweat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. My mind screamed at me to look away, to close my eyes, to do anything but stare at the woman standing in the corner of my room. But the more I fought it, the more I realized that there was no escape. There was no way out of this. Her lips moved, slowly, deliberately, the words slipping from her mouth like poison. "You can't leave." Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was low and clear, like a distant echo from somewhere deep within the bowels of the earth. It reverberated inside my skull, rattling around in my brain until it felt like it was vibrating in my teeth. "You can't leave." The words repeated in my head over and over again, as though the very essence of the room had twisted to reflect that singular idea. I was trapped. I was stuck in this nightmare, and no matter how much I struggled, no matter how much I wanted to run, there would be no way out. I tried to move again, to scream, but nothing came out. I opened my mouth, but the only sound I heard was the thundering pulse in my ears, the blood rushing in my veins like a storm. My fingers dug into the bedclothes as I gripped the edge of the mattress, trying to force my body to react. But it was as if something was holding me in place, like invisible hands pressed against my chest, keeping me pinned. And then, just when I thought I would suffocate from the weight of it all, her figure began to shift. It was slow at first, like a movement from the corner of my vision, but then the shadows around her seemed to grow thicker, more alive, as if they were reaching out to pull her closer. The veil of darkness around her seemed to solidify, and for the first time I saw the outline of her face, pale, ghostly, with sharp, hollow features that I hadn't noticed before. Her lips parted again, and this time I saw them clearly. Her teeth were jagged, sharp like the teeth of some predatory animal. The longer I stared, the more I began to question whether what I was seeing was real at all. The figure moved toward me with slow, deliberate steps, and the closer she got, the colder the room became. The air felt thick, almost solid, like walking through a fog that clung to my skin. I wanted to close my eyes, to block it all out, but my body refused to obey. Her hand reached out. It was impossibly thin, too thin, like the bones were barely covered by paper-thin skin. She extended her long fingers toward me, and I could feel the icy chill radiating from her hand. It was as if she had never felt warmth, never known what it was like to be human. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Please, just leave me alone." Her fingers brushed against the side of my face, and I felt a rush of cold, as though her touch had drained the warmth from my body. I felt the sting of something sharp, a pain that jolted through my skin like an electric shock, as though her touch was cutting into me. I could feel my pulse racing, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. And then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The air in the room cleared, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for me to take a gasping breath. I blinked hard, staring at the empty corner where she had stood, but she was gone. There was no sign of her, no trace, no presence. Only the lingering cold that clung to my skin and the deep, gnawing feeling that I hadn't seen the last of her. But the worst part, the part that I couldn't shake, was the silence that followed. It was almost worse than the encounter itself. The absence of her presence, the absence of any sound. The room was quiet, too quiet, and the only thing I could hear now was my own breathing, ragged and unsteady. I lay back in my bed, still unable to move, still unable to think clearly. All I knew was that I wasn't safe. I wasn't free. And whatever had been haunting Blackwood Academy was far from finished with me. The days following that night were a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. I could barely focus on anything. The lingering terror from the encounter in my room had seeped into every corner of my mind, clouding every thought. I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the image of her face, pale and skeletal, lingering in my thoughts like a shadow no matter where I went. It wasn't just the fear that kept me up at night. It was the uncertainty. I couldn't tell anyone. No one would believe me. No one would understand. I was trapped in a world where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurring, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I started skipping classes. It was easy enough. Headmaster Graves was a distant figure, and most of the teachers didn't seem to care whether we were in class or not. No one paid attention. No one seemed to notice how I was falling apart. I spent most of my days wandering the halls of Blackwood Academy, trying to escape the suffocating silence of my room. The building itself was a labyrinth of old corridors, dark staircases, and dimly lit classrooms. There were so many places to hide, so many rooms where I could pretend everything was fine, but the truth was, nothing felt right. Every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind through the broken windows, every shift in the shadows, it all made me jump. It all made me wonder if I was truly alone. One evening, I found myself in the old library again. I hadn't meant to go there. In fact, I had tried to avoid it, but something drew me in, some quiet, insistent pull that I couldn't ignore. I hesitated at the door, my hand resting on the brass handle. The dim light from the flickering lamps inside cast long shadows, stretching across the bookshelves, like arms reaching out to grab me. The library was empty, as usual. I walked in slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. The room smelled of dust and old leather. The air felt thick, as if it had absorbed the weight of 100 years of secrets. As I passed the rows of books, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that she was here too. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't leave. I was drawn to it like a moth to a flame, knowing full well that the closer I got to the source of the pull, the worse it would be. I walked to the back of the room, where the old globe stood, the one that I'd seen her by during our first encounter. The air felt colder there, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, creeping along the walls like something alive. Then I heard it, a sound like whispering, soft and insistent. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but then it grew louder. It was a low murmur, like the rustling of pages in the wind. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room, but I couldn't see anyone. The whispering grew louder, almost like a chant now, though I couldn't make out the words. My stomach twisted into knots as I backed away from the globe, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to leave, but that's when I saw it. The edge of the shadow, in the far corner of the room, had shifted, moving in a way that wasn't natural. I froze, my pulse racing. There, standing in the darkest corner, was a figure, just like the one I had seen before. She was dressed in the same high-collared black dress, her face obscured by the veil of shadows. But this time, I saw more. Her hands, no longer skeletal, were clutching something long and thin like a ruler. The same ruler I'd seen in the classroom, the same one I had heard tapping in the walls. Her eyes were locked onto me. I felt my legs go weak and I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. The whispering grew louder, like 1,000 voices all murmuring at once, swirling around me like a storm. The words began to take shape in my mind and I could make them out now. "You will stay," the voice said, louder than the others, more insistent. "You will stay, and you will learn. The lessons have not finished yet." I shook my head, trying to block out the voices. My heart was pounding in my ears. I had to get out of here. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It was like the air had solidified around me, keeping me trapped in the room with her. I reached for the door handle again, panic rising in my chest. I was sweating, my hands clammy. I could feel the cold air closing in on me, the shadows pushing in from all sides. I heard the ruler tap against the floor, a slow, deliberate rhythm like a countdown. 1, 2, 3. The tapping stopped. I turned, and the figure was gone. The air in the room shifted, and I was suddenly alone again. The library was quiet, save for the soft sound of my breathing and the distant creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. But I knew she was still there, somewhere in the dark corners watching me, waiting. I rushed out of the room, my heart still racing. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, the door locked behind me. I leaned against it, trying to calm my breathing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, still watching. I didn't know how much longer I could stay at Blackwood Academy. But I knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let me leave. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. In fact, I stopped sleeping altogether. The darkness of Blackwood Academy, the cold stone walls, and the ever-present feeling of being watched wore me down until I could barely function. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, Eleanor Voss, her long, bony fingers reaching out to pull me into the bell tower. I heard the tapping of the ruler in my mind, steady and unyielding, counting down the days until my lesson was complete. The more I resisted, the more persistent she became. I could feel her in every room I entered, in every hallway I walked down. The academy felt like a prison, and I was trapped inside with no way to escape. On the third night after my encounter in the library, I was unable to stand the pressure any longer. My mind was unraveling, and I needed answers. There had to be something, anything that could explain what was happening, something that would help me make sense of it all. I found the headmaster in his office late at night, as usual. He was hunched over his desk, scribbling furiously. In a ledger, his glasses perched precariously on the edge of his nose. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen as I entered, as if the very walls were conspiring against me.
"Headmaster Graves," I said, my voice hoarse from days of sleeplessness. "I need to know what happened here. What's going on? What happened to her? Eleanor Voss. Why is she still here?" He didn't look up at first. He just kept writing, his
pen scratching across the paper. But then he slowly set the pen down and sighed deeply, as though this conversation had been a long time coming. "Sit down, Ethan," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "This isn't something I ever wanted you to know, but I suppose it's time." I sat across from him, my heart racing. He leaned back in his chair, staring into the dimly lit room as though searching for something. After a long pause, he spoke. "Eleanor Voss wasn't just a headmistress," he began. "She was something more. She believed in controlling the students, keeping them in line. The disappearances in 1913, they weren't just some random event. Eleanor was involved. She made a pact with something dark. Something that lives in this academy, in the land around it. She believed it would give her power. If she kept her students in fear, kept them from breaking the rules, she could harness that power and use it to control them. I felt my stomach churn. So she made a deal with the devil? Not exactly, Headmaster Graves muttered, looking away. It wasn't something that simple. It was an ancient ritual tied to the land itself. A spirit. A force that's been here long before the school was built. The truth is, Eleanor never intended for the students to disappear. She thought she could control the force, but she was wrong. The force took them, and it took her too. The room seemed to close in around me as I listened to his words. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was in too deep, too far, down a path that couldn't be undone. But I had to know more. I had to understand why she had chosen me. Then why is she still here, I demanded. Why is she after me? What does she want? Graves shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edges of his desk. She's not herself anymore, Ethan. Her spirit is trapped here. And it's angry. It doesn't want to let go. It wants to keep taking, keep feeding on fear and despair. And once you've been marked, once she's chosen you, you're a part of her lesson. She teaches with pain, she teaches with terror. I felt sick to my stomach. The walls seemed to close in tighter around me. The tapping of the ruler, the whispers in the halls, the feeling of her presence. Everything made sense now, and nothing made sense at the same time. I had to leave. I had to escape before it was too late, but it was already too late. As if on cue, the lights in the office flickered and died. The room was plunged into darkness. I could hear my breathing, shallow and panicked, but I couldn't hear anything else. The silence felt suffocating, as if the world had stopped. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the ruler tapping against the desk. Slow, steady, counting down. 1, 2, 3. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I turned to Headmaster Graves, but he was no longer there. In his place stood Eleanor Voss, her veil pulled back, revealing her ghastly, contorted face. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her mouth was stretched in an eternal, silent scream. "You are late for class," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The lesson is about to begin." I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. I could feel her fingers, cold and skeletal, wrapping around my throat, pulling me toward the bell. Or the last thing I saw was her face, smiling, cold and dead, as she whispered, "You will never graduate." And then, everything went dark. The next morning, Blackwood Academy was found abandoned. There were no signs of the students, no traces of their disappearance. The building was eerily silent, as if time had stopped. The only thing that remained was the sound of a ruler tapping in the empty halls, counting down to something that would never end. They say Blackwood Academy is still accepting new students, but if you're brave enough to walk by the ruins on a stormy night, you might see the faint glow of a lantern flickering in the bell tower window, and hear the whisper of a teacher who never stopped giving lessons. Because some lessons once learned can never be unlearned. The rain had been pouring down steadily all morning, soaking the streets of Black Harbor, Washington. The coastal town, perched on the jagged cliffs overlooking the Pacific, always had an eerie feeling to it, but today it felt even more oppressive. Maybe it was the history, or the dark clouds rolling in over the ocean, or maybe it was the fact that Lucas and I, Jake Rivera, were being dragged on a school field trip to a place none of us really cared about, Fort Hollowgate. Fort Hollowgate was one of those places that was more famous for its ghost stories than its actual history. A decaying Civil War-era military fortress built in 1862, it had gained notoriety in 1898 when an entire battalion of soldiers had vanished overnight, leaving only rusted rifles, broken cannons, and a cryptic journal entry. They came from the tunnels. After that, the fort had sat empty for years, its dark history becoming more and more twisted, until it was turned into a tourist attraction. Now, every year, Westmore High School's history class made their way to the fortress for a guided tour. Most of the students went for the same reason, to get out of class. But for Lucas and me, it was just another boring day, a waste of a Friday afternoon. We stood near the back of the group, barely listening to the tour guide. She rambled on about the fort's role in the Civil War, the soldiers stationed there, and the mysterious disappearance of the battalion. But all I could think about was the relentless rain and the way the mist clung to the crumbling walls of the fortress like something alive. Lucas nudged me with his elbow. "Dude, this place is a joke," he muttered, his voice low. "I'm half tempted to ditch this and go grab some burgers." I smiled, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, but if we make it out without even pretending to listen, you know we're getting detention, right?" "Whatever, I'd rather have detention than be stuck here." Lucas rolled his eyes, his face grim. But the idea of sneaking away was appealing. I could feel the weight of the old fortress pressing down on me, its history lingering in the air like a bad smell. As the tour group moved deeper into the fort's inner halls, I saw an opening that led into the dark, moss-covered tunnels below. The others were all distracted, absorbed in the tour guide's monologue. Lucas shot me a grin. "Think they'll notice if we slip away?" I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was paying attention. "Nah, let's go see what's down there." We broke off from the group, ducking into the narrow entrance. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of mildew. Our flashlights cut through the heavy darkness as we moved deeper into the tunnels, the concrete walls dripping with moisture. The place felt ancient, like it had been forgotten by time. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. "I can't believe they're letting us explore this place," Lucas said, his voice hushed, as if he was already regretting the decision. "Feels like we're about to get trapped in some horror movie." I chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, the whole place is supposed to be haunted, that's what the brochure said." As we ventured farther, the air grew colder. Not just a little chill, but a deep, unnatural cold that sank into our bones. I shivered, flicking the beam of my flashlight around the tunnel, searching for something to distract myself from the creeping unease settling in my stomach. Suddenly, I felt something brush against the back of my neck. At first, I thought it was just the cold, but then it came again, like a cold breath, wet and clammy. My skin prickled and I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the dark. "Dude, what was that?" I whispered, my voice tight. My throat felt dry and I could taste the dampness of the air on my tongue. Lucas's face was pale. He looked as spooked as I felt. "I don't know, but it's freezing in here, man. It wasn't this cold a minute ago." I opened my mouth to say something, but then I heard it. A whisper, soft at first, just beyond the range of my hearing. I held my breath, straining to make it out. It was barely audible, but the words were there. The whispers, hundreds of them, all overlapping each other, sounded almost like English, but just beyond comprehension. I couldn't make sense of the words, but the feeling in my chest, the hairs standing up on my arms, told me it was something more than just a random noise. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice low, barely above a whisper. Lucas's eyes darted around the tunnel. "Yeah. Dude, we need to get out of here." But before we could make a move, the whispering grew louder, the voices melding into a single guttural word. "Run." A cold wave of panic hit me. I grabbed Lucas's arm, my heart hammering in my chest. "Let's go. Now." We turned, bolting toward the tunnel entrance, but the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. The exit no closer. The walls seemed to close in around us, the whispers following us, getting louder with each step. We didn't look back. By the time we finally made it back to the main hall, I felt like my lungs were on fire, my chest heaving as if I had just run a marathon. Lucas and I stumbled into the light, nearly crashing into one of the tour guides who was standing by the entrance, looking at us with a mix of confusion and annoyance. "You guys okay?" the guide asked, her eyebrows furrowed. "Yeah, fine," I muttered, my voice shaky. I shot a glance at Lucas, who was still wide-eyed, clearly as shaken as I was. The tour guide gave us a half smile, clearly not too concerned. "Well, try to keep up. We're going into the artillery bunkers next." I didn't want to go back. I wanted to run, to get out of this fortress that seemed to swallow you whole, but I didn't have a choice. We had to keep going with the group. So we fell in line with the others, trying to ignore the thudding of our hearts and the overwhelming chill that seemed to have settled in my bones. As we followed the group into the old bunkers, the temperature plummeted. I don't mean a slight drop in temperature. I mean it felt like the air itself had turned into ice. It was June, summer, so it made no sense for it to be this cold, yet my breath fogged in front of me as if I were standing in the middle of a winter night. "Dude, are you feeling this?" Lucas muttered, his voice strained. I nodded, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. "Yeah, it's freezing. This place is messed up." We kept walking deeper into the bunker, our flashlights flickering erratically like the batteries were failing, even though I had just changed them before the trip. The air was dense with the smell of damp stone and decaying wood, but there was something else, something metallic about the air, like rust and salt water. The guide led us to the farthest corner of the bunker, a place where the walls were barely standing, the mortar cracked and blackened from years of neglect. A few of the other kids lingered behind, snapping photos of the deteriorating walls and the broken artillery that had once stood guard. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something just out of sight, waiting for us to get too comfortable. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room on the wall was a frost-covered handprint. It was fresh. Too fresh. Like someone had pressed their hand against the wall only moments before we entered. The edges of the print were sharp, jagged, like it had been burned into the stone, and the cold emanated from it. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. "Hey, look at this," I said, motioning for Lucas to come over. "This isn't right." Lucas hesitated but walked over, his face going pale as he looked at the print. "That wasn't here before," he muttered, his voice tight. "This place doesn't have any refrigeration units, right?" I shook my head. "No way. It's just old stone and metal." The guide, who had been explaining the history of the fort to the others, finally turned and noticed us standing there. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm. Pointed to the handprint. "What's that about?" She looked at it for a moment, her expression unreadable before giving a soft laugh. "Oh, that's just condensation. This old building, the humidity, it does strange things to the walls. But I wasn't convinced it wasn't just condensation. This was something else. It felt wrong, like something was trying to leave its mark. Something cold, something ancient. The print looked almost too deliberate, too precise to just be a random drip of moisture. The air around me seemed to grow even colder, as if the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. I tried to shake off the chill that had settled in my bones, but it wouldn't go away. It clung to me, sinking deeper like it was trying to pull me into the stone. The other students, oblivious to what we had found, continued snapping photos and chatting amongst themselves. Lucas and I exchanged a look, silently agreeing that we needed to get out of that room. But as we turned to follow the group, I heard something. A low scraping sound, like nails on concrete, coming from the direction of the tunnels we had just come from. I stopped dead in my tracks, the blood draining from my face. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Lucas, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond right away, but his face said it all. He had heard it too. "Let's just go," he said, his voice tight with fear. He grabbed my arm, pulling me along, and I didn't protest. The air felt suffocating now, the walls closing in around us, and all I wanted to do was get out of the cold. Get out of the place that had become far too real. We followed the rest of the group back to the exit, the whispers of the tunnels and the scraping sound still echoing in the back of my mind, a reminder that some things were better left undiscovered. But as we stepped back into the relative warmth of the outside air, the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, a cold weight on my chest, like the fort wasn't done with us yet. And I had a sinking feeling that we had only scratched the surface. The rest of the tour passed in a blur, my thoughts racing as I tried to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with Fort Hollowgate. The cold hadn't left me, and the whispers I had heard deep in the tunnels kept echoing in my mind. I couldn't tell anyone, at least not in a way that made sense. How could I explain to the teacher that I heard voices in the walls or that the temperature had dropped so suddenly it felt like something was pulling the warmth from my body? Lucas stayed quiet too, but I could see the same unease in his eyes. We were both trying to ignore it, trying to act normal, but the feeling that we weren't alone kept creeping up on us. We walked through the fort's outer grounds. The parade field stretched out before us, the damp air mixing with the scent of old stone and moss. The guide led us to a section of the field where old cannons were on display, rusted and worn down by decades of neglect. But as we stood there, looking at the old artillery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced to my right at the far end of the parade grounds and froze. Across the field stood figures, shadowy, indistinct, like they were made of smoke, but there. Tall, thin, and dressed in tattered uniforms that looked older than anything I had ever seen. They were standing in formation, perfectly still, their backs to me. "Lucas, do you see them?" I whispered, my throat tight. He followed my gaze, squinting. At first I thought he was going to dismiss it, like everything else we had experienced today. But his face shifted, and I saw the same confusion, the same unease, that had been eating at me all day. "What the hell?" he murmured under his breath, his voice barely audible. The figures were standing perfectly still as if they were waiting for something, waiting for us. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched them. I tried to blink, to clear my eyes, but when I looked again, the figures hadn't moved. Then came the strangest part. I blinked again, and they were closer. Not just a little closer, 10 feet away. The chill in the air deepened, and I felt it. Again, that suffocating presence closing in, like the world was shrinking, and all I could see were these soldiers standing silently, watching. Their faces were obscured by the darkness, but I could feel their eyes on me, or at least what I imagined their eyes would be like. Cold, empty, lifeless. "Lucas, we need to go," I said, my voice shaking. I grabbed his arm, but he didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the figures. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. I pulled harder on his arm, nearly yanking him off his feet, but his legs didn't move. His gaze was still fixed on the soldiers. Another blink, and they were even closer. No more than 5 feet away, their figures now sharper, more defined. I could see their tattered uniforms, dirt-streaked and worn from what seemed like decades of exposure. Their rifles were slung at their sides, rusted and useless, and their faces. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them. Hollow eyes staring back at me. "Lucas!" I screamed, and that seemed to break him from his trance. He snapped his head around, his face pale, his mouth agape. "Let's go," he said, his voice trembling. We didn't need to say anything more. We turned and sprinted across the field, not caring who saw us, not looking back even once. I could still hear the soft scrape of boots behind us, but when I dared a glance over my shoulder, there was nothing. The figures were gone, just like that, as if they had never been there. We reached the group, our teacher giving us a bemused look. "Everything okay, boys?" she asked, her voice light, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. I looked at Lucas, trying to read his face, but I could see the same fear in his eyes that mirrored my own. Neither of us could explain what we had just seen. "Yeah," Lucas said after a beat, though his voice didn't sound convincing. "We're fine." The rest of the tour was a blur of half-hearted explanations and half-formed questions that neither of us dared ask. My mind kept spinning, replaying the figures on the field, the way they had moved closer with each blink, and the way I felt their eyes on me even when I wasn't looking. That night, when we returned to the hotel, I lay awake in bed, staring. At the ceiling, the images of the soldiers in tattered uniforms still burned into my mind. What were they? Were they real? Or had we both imagined it? Lucas had been there with me, but I didn't want to ask him more about it. I didn't want to relive it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever those soldiers were, whatever they had been, they weren't just gone. They had been waiting for us, and that thought haunted me long after I closed my eyes. But the worst part? The part that didn't let me sleep? The feeling that we hadn't run far enough, that the soldiers, and whatever else was lurking in the fort, were still waiting for us to come back. That night, sleep never came easy. I tossed and turned in my hotel room, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Lucas had crashed, out in the bed next to mine, snoring softly, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those soldiers, those shadowy figures standing still across the parade grounds, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. The more I thought about them, the harder it became to breathe, like the air was pressing down on my chest. I finally gave up trying to sleep and sat up in bed, staring into the darkness of the room. The small glow from the streetlights outside barely reached the windowsill, casting long shadows across the floor. My phone, lying on the nightstand, caught my eye. I had been ignoring it all evening, not wanting to get caught up in the normal distractions of the world. But now, with my thoughts racing, I reached for it. There was a notification from my photo app, a notification I didn't remember getting. One new memory. Fort Hollowgate, it said. I froze. The app automatically backed up photos from my phone's camera, but I hadn't taken any pictures today. I hadn't even thought to snap anything, so why was there a new photo? With trembling fingers, I opened the app, my stomach tight with dread. The photo appeared on the screen, Lucas and me, standing in the dark tunnels beneath the fort. We were both laughing, probably making some joke, maybe about how ridiculous the whole tour had been. But then I saw it. In the shadows behind us, barely visible, were figures, rows of skeletal soldiers in tattered uniforms, standing just out of the reach of the flashlight's beam. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, like they had been preserved in the dark for centuries. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I stared at the screen. I zoomed in, my breath coming quicker. The figures were clearer now, their bones stark against the darkness. They were standing directly behind us, motionless, as if they had been frozen in time, just like they had been on the parade grounds. I quickly swiped through the other photos from the day, desperately hoping it was some kind of glitch or bad lighting, but they were all normal. Only this one, the photo from the tunnels, held the eerie figures. I couldn't breathe. I dropped the phone on the bed and ran my hands through my hair, trying to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Lucas and I had been alone, in the tunnels for most of the time, and neither of us had noticed anything out of the ordinary. We didn't hear footsteps, didn't see shadows moving behind us. How could this photo exist? How could those soldiers be there, standing behind us when we hadn't even known they were there? I stood up, pacing the room. The walls felt like they were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was still lingering in the shadows. I glanced over at Lucas, who was still sound asleep, oblivious to the nightmare that was unfolding. I wanted to wake him up, to show him the photo, but part of me was afraid of what he might say. Maybe he'd tell me it was just a bad memory, a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my phone again, looking at the photo one more time. This time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the corner of the photo, partially obscured by the darkness, was a figure that hadn't been there earlier. It was just a blur at first, but now I could make out a face, pale, twisted, and wide-eyed. A figure that didn't belong in the photo at all. It was staring directly at me, its expression twisted with some kind of inhuman intensity. I recoiled, dropping the phone again, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just a weird glitch. Something had happened at that fort. Something had followed us back. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I spent the hours staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning. What did this mean? Had we unleashed something in the fort? Had we stumbled into a curse that had been waiting to claim us? The morning came, but it didn't feel like relief. When I looked at Lucas, still sleeping like nothing was wrong, I felt a cold knot tighten in my chest. The soldiers, the shadows, the figures in the tunnels, they were still with us, still watching, and I had a sinking feeling that they weren't going to let us leave. I didn't tell Lucas about the photo. He was already half awake, grumbling about breakfast and his bad back. But as I looked at him, I knew he had seen something too. Something we couldn't explain. He'd seen the soldiers on the parade grounds, just like I had. He didn't need to see that photo to know something was wrong. We were both trapped in the same nightmare now, and I knew the worst part. It was only just beginning. I didn't tell Lucas about the photo. Maybe I should have, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like if I said it out loud, I would be admitting to something I couldn't explain. The cold weight of the photo sat in my mind like a heavy stone pressing down on me as we made our way through the day. The fort tour was over and we had a couple of hours before we were supposed to meet the group and head back to the bus, but I could barely focus on anything. I kept thinking about the photo, the soldiers, the figure in the shadows. It felt like we hadn't really left the fort. It had followed us. We walked around Black Harbor, trying to distract ourselves. The fog was still thick, making everything look like a scene from some twisted ghost story. The town was quiet, too quiet, as though the streets were holding their breath. I wanted to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut, but every time I glanced over at Lucas, I saw the same thing in his eyes, an unease that hadn't been there before. I wasn't sure if it was just me, but I knew he felt it too. Whatever had happened in that fort wasn't just in our heads. Finally, we ended up at the town library, a small old building with shelves stacked high with dusty books. It was too early for the rest of the group to catch up with us, so we slipped inside, hoping to find something to take our minds off what had happened. As we wandered through the narrow aisles, I found myself drawn to the history section. My hand hovered over the worn spines of books about the Civil War, the history of Black Harbor, the fort itself. Then I saw it. A book titled The Lost Battalion of Fort Hollowgate. Its cover faded and cracked. The title seemed to jump out at me, like it had been waiting there for years just for this moment. I pulled it off the shelf and flipped it open. As I skimmed the pages, I found detailed accounts of the fort's construction, its role in the war, and the tragic disappearance of the battalion in 1898. But the deeper I read, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a history book. It was a warning. On the last page, scrawled in frantic handwriting, were the words that sent a chill down my spine. They never left. They wait in the walls. They wait in the ground. And when you hear them whisper, it's already too late. I froze, staring at the words, my blood running cold. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I reread the lines. It was like the author knew. Like they had written this message for someone to find. Someone who had come after the soldiers. Someone who had walked the tunnels, heard the whispers, seen the shadows. A heavy weight settled in my stomach. I looked over at Lucas, who had been browsing nearby. His face was pale, his eyes wide. I could see that he had heard something too. He must have noticed the change in my expression because he walked over, his gaze following mine to the book in my hands. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I think we were right. Whatever happened at that fort, it's not over. Those soldiers, they never left. They're still here. They're still waiting." Lucas didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the page in front of me, his face expressionless, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing. He'd seen the figures, the shadows, just like I had. He had felt the same chill, the same suffocating presence in the tunnels. We had both known something wasn't right, but this was the confirmation. Without a word, Lucas stepped closer, gently touching the page. "What are we supposed to do with this? What does it mean?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to close the book, walk away, and pretend like none of it had ever happened. But I knew deep down that it was too late for that. We had already crossed some line, some invisible boundary, and now it was too late to turn back. A soft rustle behind me broke the silence, and I turned to find a librarian standing at the end of the aisle. Her eyes narrowed as she watched us. She wasn't old, but there was something about her, something ancient in the way she carried herself. I didn't want to ask, didn't want to know, but I had to. "Excuse me," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "Do you know anything about this book?" The Lost Battalion of Fort Hollowgate? She didn't respond at first. Then slowly she walked toward us, her eyes never leaving the pages. "Be careful with that one," she said, her voice low and grave. "It's been passed down through generations of this town, always finding its way back into the hands of those who are meant to find it. Some stories should remain buried. Some things shouldn't be disturbed." Her words hung in the air like a warning, and I knew it wasn't just about the book. It was about what we had done by coming to Fort Hollowgate, what we had uncovered. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving us standing there in the middle of the library, the weight of her words sinking into me like a stone in water. I closed the book slowly, my fingers trembling as I placed it back on the shelf. "We shouldn't have gone there, Lucas," I whispered. "We shouldn't have gone into those tunnels." He didn't answer. We both stood there, staring at the shelves, the air thick with the realization that we had uncovered something we weren't supposed to know, something that was never meant to be found. We left the library without saying another word, the weight of the book's warning pressing down on us. We couldn't undo what we had seen, what we had heard, and we couldn't outrun the soldiers, those hollow-eyed skeletal figures that had followed us back from the fort. As we walked out into the foggy streets of Black Harbor, I knew one thing for certain. The fort had never truly let us go, and now it was waiting for the next time we would hear the whispers, calling us back into the dark. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the stress of finals, from the late-night study sessions and the ever-growing weight of expectations. Mia, Ryan, Jake, and I had been planning it for months, eager to get out of the city and into nature. The online listing for Holloway Cabin promised rustic charm, a secluded getaway far from the distractions of the modern world. The photos were all pine trees and a log cabin surrounded by snow. It looked perfect. We rented it through a website we'd used before, one that seemed reliable enough. The listing didn't mention anything about bloodstains on the floorboards, or the unsettling silence that seemed to swallow the forest at night. We didn't know that the place had been abandoned for years, or that the locals in Devil's Hollow, the nearest town, refused to speak of it at all. They just called it the Hungry House, but we didn't think anything of it at the time. When we arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees. The cabin looked ancient, its logs weathered and darkened by time. Still, it was exactly what we wanted. Quiet, isolated, perfect for a weekend of hiking, drinking, and most importantly, escaping the world. The first night was uneventful, but eerie in its own way. We unloaded our bags and stoked the fireplace, filling the cabin with warmth. The air outside was sharp, the kind of cold that makes you want to bundle up, and the snow was soft underfoot, crinkling as we moved about the yard. We even laughed, a little, at how cliché everything felt, like we had stepped into a horror movie. But none of us took it seriously. Why would we? It was just a cabin in the woods, right? As night fell, we settled in with drinks and the kind of banter you'd expect from 4 college students eager to forget about exams. But then, things started to get strange. It started small at first. A scratching sound at the window. At first we thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, something harmless. Ryan, always the skeptic, scoffed and cracked open another beer. "It's just some critter," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But then it kept going. The scratching, the odd scuttling noise. It wasn't just random anymore, it was deliberate, methodical. It circled the cabin, moving slowly along the perimeter as though it was searching for something. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or an animal again. But there was something off about it. Something deliberate. When we went to bed, I thought I might be imagining things. That was until 3:17 a.m. when we heard it again. 3 knocks, slow and steady. 3 knocks on the front door. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming at first. I sat up in bed, my heart racing in the silence that followed. Jake, who was sleeping in the room next to mine, threw off his covers and sprang from bed. "I'll check it out," he muttered, half asleep. But none of us stopped him. We all followed Jake to the door, peering over his shoulder. The door was solid, locked, but the knocking was unmistakable. 3 knocks, just like the last time. Jake flung the door open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Outside, the clearing was bathed in moonlight. There was nothing there, just the snow-covered yard and the trees standing silent and still. Nothing moving, no footprints, no animal tracks. But I could feel it. Something was watching us from the tree line. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I could tell the others felt it too. None of us spoke. The knocking had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. "We should go back inside," Mia said, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. Ryan didn't argue, none of us did. We just turned slowly and walked back into the cabin. That night we tried to sleep, but none of us did. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel something lurking out there, something that didn't belong. And when I finally managed to fall into an uneasy slumber, I dreamed of shadowy figures moving in the trees, their shapes twisted and wrong. The next morning we tried to laugh it off, but none of us were convinced. We had to shake the feeling of unease off before we let it ruin the weekend. So we went outside, grabbed our hiking gear, and made plans for the day. But something in me knew we hadn't heard the last of the knocking, and something told me that the woods around Holloway Cabin weren't as empty as they seemed. The daylight hours passed uneventfully as we tried to push the weirdness of last night to the back of our minds. We hiked, exploring the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. The air was fresh, crisp, and the kind of clean you only get in the deep wilderness. The towering pines creaked as the wind shifted through them, and the sun filtered in, casting dappled shadows across the snow-covered ground. Everything seemed normal again, or at least as normal as things could be after the night we'd had. Mia and I were taking photographs of the landscape, trying to capture the beauty of the woods in their winter stillness. Ryan and Jake were up ahead, joking and laughing as they walked through the trees. The camaraderie helped, but underneath it all, I could still feel the tension that had built up overnight. That constant feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, was hard to shake. We eventually made our way back to the cabin, our boots crunching on the snow. Ryan seemed more at ease now, but I could still see a flicker of unease in his eyes every now and then. When we arrived back, we had lunch, and the conversation turned to lighter topics. Nothing about the knocks or the figures we had thought we saw between the trees, but none of us could forget what had happened. It was Lex who found the cigar box. She had been searching for firewood in the dusty old cellar when she stumbled across it. She came up from the basement holding the box in her arms like it was fragile, as though it might fall apart in her hands. "I found something," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet of the cabin. I stood up from the table, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" She opened the box, revealing old, faded photographs, black and white images that looked like they had been taken decades ago. The edges were curled and worn, as though they had been handled often, but the faces of the people in the photos were still clear. There were pictures of men, women, and children, all wearing clothing from a different time, from a place far removed from the modern world we knew. "Who are these people?" Jake asked, leaning over her shoulder to get a better look. Lex carefully flipped through the photos. "I don't know, but something strange about them. Every photo in the box seemed to feature different individuals, yet they all had one thing in common. They looked so out of place in the cabin, in the woods surrounding it. The people in the photos had no smiles, their faces stern and serious. But it was the next thing that made my stomach twist. Every face in every photo was scratched out, the marks harsh and violent, as though someone had used a sharp object to erase them. A few photos had just a single scratch across the face. Others were completely obliterated. Some even had multiple marks running through them, making it impossible to tell who they had been. Lex hesitated, then flipped to the last photo in the box. It was a family photo. 2 adults, a teenage boy and a younger girl, standing together on the cabin's front porch. They looked out of place, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that reminded me of something from the 1930s. But what struck me the most was the handwriting on the back, written in what looked like an unsteady, almost frantic scrawl. They came from the trees. Don't let them in. I felt a coldness wash over me. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. But before I could speak, Lex dropped the box. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and the photos scattered in every direction. We rushed to pick them up, and that's when we saw something that made my heart stop. The scattered photos had arranged themselves in a perfect circle on the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around at the others, trying to make sense of it. The hairs on my arms stood up. There was no way that had happened by accident. We'd all been standing near the box, but none of us had touched the photos. "What the hell?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Ryan was the first to speak, his tone sharp with frustration, though I could see the fear in his eyes too. "It's just a coincidence. It has to be." But the feeling in the room had changed. The warmth from the fire no longer felt comforting, but oppressive. There was something wrong, something dangerous in the air. "Look," Jake said, his voice low. "This doesn't feel right. The scratches on the faces, and that note." He shook his head. "We need to leave. Now." But Lex, who had been quiet since she found the box, was staring at the photos, her face pale. "We can't leave," she said quietly. "I think it's too late for that." I looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flickered to the window, and I followed her gaze. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, but there was something different about them now. They looked closer. The shadows between the trunks seemed deeper, more menacing, and that's when I heard it, the sound of something scraping across the outside of the cabin, soft but deliberate. It was the same sound we had heard last night when something or someone had circled the house, knocking at the door. I felt the color drain from my face as I stood there, frozen. "Don't let them in," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. But it was too late. The thing that had been watching us from the shadows was already here. The sound was unmistakable. At first it was just the soft scratching against the windows, a slow, deliberate scrape that made my skin crawl. I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me, that feeling of being watched, of something waiting. The shadows in the room deepened as though the walls themselves were closing in, squeezing out the light. I glanced around, trying to find something, anything, that would make sense of what was happening. Mia stood motionless by the fireplace, her wide eyes flickering between the windows and the door. Ryan and Jake were frozen, their faces pale with disbelief, and Lex, the one who had found the photos, was the most affected. She was staring at the window, her expression tense, her lips parted as if she was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the vibrations in my bones, a low hum that made everything in the room seem to vibrate, as if the air itself had become charged. I moved to the window, my steps hesitant, and pushed the curtain aside. Nothing. There was nothing out there. No raccoons, no wind, no animals. Just the moonlight streaming through the trees, casting long, thin shadows that stretched across the snow-covered ground. But then, in the distance, I saw them. Figures. They were standing just at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the darkness, watching us. They were tall, impossibly thin, their limbs stretched in unnatural angles that didn't belong in this world. Their bodies blended into the trees, their outlines shifting and warping as if they were part of the very shadows themselves. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick and heavy, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had turned hostile. The scratching outside stopped suddenly, and in its place came something far worse. Whispers. The whispers slithered through the cracks in the cabin, cold and unnerving. The voices were soft, unintelligible at first, but then they became clearer. "Let us in," they hissed. "We're so cold." I felt my stomach turn as I stood frozen in place. The words sounded like they were coming from all directions, filling the room, pressing against my ears. I could almost feel the breath of the voices on the back of my neck, like fingers brushing against my skin. My body reacted on instinct, and I grabbed the closest thing to me, an old rusted lamp that had been left on the table, and held it out in front of me like a weapon. "We have to leave. Now." Mia's voice was low, trembling, but it cut through the terror in my mind. I looked over at her, my eyes wide with panic. She was standing by the door, her hand on the knob, but she didn't move. Her face was pale, her breath shallow, like she was holding on to her sanity by a thread. Jake, who had been standing silently beside me, finally spoke up. "What the hell are we supposed to do? The car's stuck and the radio's out." Ryan shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "It's not just the car. We need to get out of here, get away from this place. The cabin, it's not just abandoned, it's still alive, still watching us." Suddenly the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was more deafening than the whispers had been. The absence of sound felt like a warning, an ominous pause, before something far worse would come. I turned toward the front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The cold metal burned against my skin. But before I could open it, I noticed something. The shadows. They were closer. Outside, the figures in the trees had moved. They were no longer standing still. They were circling the cabin, each step deliberate, measured. And then, I saw one of them step forward, its long, bony hand reaching for the window. I gasped, stumbling back from the door. The thing outside had a face now, or at least something that resembled a face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that reflected the darkness like black pools of ink. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, sharp and glistening like they had been filed to points. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then the knocking started again. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the door. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, anything, but my body was frozen. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door, from the figure outside that had just reached for the handle. I could hear its breath, shallow and cold, through the cracks in the wood. I could almost feel its presence pushing against the door, testing it, pressing in on us. "Let us in," it whispered, so softly that I could barely hear it. But the voice was unmistakable, cold, distant, filled with a hunger I couldn't begin to understand. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The knocking ceased. The whispering stopped. The figures outside disappeared into the trees. For a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. I looked around the cabin. The others were staring at me wide-eyed, each of us caught in the grip of a terror we couldn't explain, couldn't make sense of. We had no idea what had just happened or how we were going to get out. But the worst part was the unease that still lingered, crawling under my skin like an itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The air was suffocating. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, but it felt like the oxygen had been drained from the room. My heart was hammering so hard that I could hear it in my ears, a rapid pulsing beat that drowned out everything else. The sense of urgency, of danger, pressed down on us, suffocating any thought of reason or calm. For a long moment, no one moved. We were all standing by the door, frozen, staring at one another as if expecting someone else to make the first move. But no one could. None of us could process what had happened or figure out what to do next. All I could think of was the figure outside, its bony fingers stretching toward the window, the hollow eyes that seemed to see into my very soul. Ryan's voice was the first to break the silence, a low, shaky whisper. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here now." It was the truth. The car was useless. The cabin was still, too still, and everything outside felt wrong, like the forest itself was closing in on us. But as Ryan reached for the door, his hand trembling on the knob, something held him back. The same instinct that had paralyzed me had taken root in all of us. Fear. A fear so deep, so ancient that we couldn't fight it. We were trapped. I can't," Mia stammered, her face pale, her voice breaking. She was gripping the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Something's out there. They're watching us. I wanted to argue, to tell her it was just our minds playing tricks on us. But I couldn't. My thoughts felt foggy, clouded by fear, by the weight of whatever was lurking just outside. The dark shape in the trees, the thing with the needle-like teeth, was not something we could ignore. It was real. It was coming for us. The whispering had stopped, but the silence felt worse. Every second that passed without any new noise, without any movement, made the dread crawl deeper under my skin. I knew it wasn't over. Something was waiting, something that would only strike when we least expected it. Jake, who had been standing by the window, suddenly turned toward the door, his face set with a determination I hadn't seen before. "We don't have time to stand here. We go now, or we don't go at all." None of us could argue with that. With shaking hands, I grabbed my jacket and started for the door. Mia hesitated behind me, her face still pale, but I didn't stop. We couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. Pushed the door open with a slow, cautious movement, trying to keep the sound to a minimum, afraid that the very act of opening it would alert whatever was out there. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp. And for a moment I felt a flicker of something, relief maybe, that we were finally outside, away from the suffocating presence of the cabin. But that feeling was fleeting. As we stepped onto the porch, the sounds of the forest felt alien. It was dead silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The night was too still, and the shadowy figures in the distance, those shapes that had been watching us, seemed to loom even closer now. I scanned the tree line, but there was no movement, just the same oppressive quiet. Ryan was the first to move, heading toward the car. "We need to go, now." We followed him, moving quickly, almost at a run, but my eyes kept darting back to the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something just out of sight. I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, something shifting behind the trees, and my stomach twisted. It was there, watching, waiting. We reached the car, but when I tried to open the door, my fingers were numb, slipping off the handle. The cold was biting, and my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. I looked up, panic rising in my chest. The car was still, silent, no engine running, no warmth from the heater. The engine was dead. "No," I whispered, my throat dry. "No, no, no." Jake was at the front of the car, frantically trying to start the engine, but the ignition wouldn't turn. I could hear his muttered curses under his breath as he twisted the key again and again, but nothing happened. "Shit. The battery's dead," Ryan shouted, his voice tight with panic. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pound my fists against the car and demand that it start, but I didn't have the energy for it. All I could do was look around, my heart racing as I scanned the darkness, knowing that something was closing in on us. The woods, the trees, they were alive with something that wasn't human. I could feel it in my bones. "Let us in." I heard the whisper again, this time far too close, just behind us. I spun around, my eyes wide with terror. There was nothing there, no shape, no figure, just the forest and the night. But I knew it was there, hiding in the shadows. I could hear it breathing, feel it stalking us. "Run!" Mia screamed, her voice breaking, and that's when I saw it. A figure, pale and thin, just inside the tree line. It stepped out into the clearing, its arms raised in a motion that was too deliberate, too slow. The thing was reaching for us, its fingers elongated, its mouth open, showing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. The air felt thick with malice as we turned and ran. There was no thought, no plan, just the desperate instinct to get away. The branches whipped at my face as I sprinted, stumbling through the underbrush. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them behind us, footsteps in the distance moving faster, too fast to be anything natural. I didn't dare look back. We ran until we reached the road, until we were far from the cabin and the horrors lurking in the trees. We stopped only when the cabin was far behind, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. The quiet wasn't comforting. It was just another form of their presence, waiting for the right moment. That's when I realized the worst part. The door had been open when we left, and now, We had no idea if we would ever escape what we had unleashed. Thereon, ride back to Devil's Hollow felt like a dream, a fevered, disjointed blur of movement and adrenaline. Every mile between us and Holloway Cabin felt like a small victory, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, that the woods themselves were alive with intent. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see something, some shadow moving in the distance, but there was only the dark, empty stretch of road behind us. I kept trying to convince myself it was over, that we had outrun it, but the hollow pit in my stomach grew heavier with each passing minute. The silence in the car was deafening, each of us lost in our own thoughts, unwilling to break it. Mia was staring out the window, her face pale and drawn, while Ryan gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Jake, in the back seat, kept muttering under his breath, repeating over and over again that it wasn't real, that we'd imagined it. But I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. We didn't speak of it. Couldn't. The horrors of what we'd seen, the things we'd heard, the cold and unnatural presence in the woods, it was too much. The words wouldn't come, couldn't come, because the very act of speaking about it felt like inviting it back into our lives. It was a relief to finally reach the town, to drive through the sleepy streets of Devil's Hollow, where the houses seemed too quaint, too normal compared to the nightmare we had just left behind. But even as we passed familiar landmarks, something felt wrong. The town was too quiet. The trees on the outskirts of town were dark and dense, almost as if they were pressing closer, watching us. We dropped Mia off first, her apartment just a few blocks away. She barely said goodbye, just a hurried wave, before disappearing into the building. Ryan and I exchanged a brief look, an unspoken agreement that we were both glad to be rid of her for the moment. She needed time to process, just like we did, but I had a sinking feeling in my stomach that she wouldn't be okay. Jake was quiet too as we pulled up to his place. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. "You good?" I asked him, but I knew the answer. "Yeah, man. Yeah," he said. But it was the same lie we had been telling ourselves since we left the cabin. Jake stepped out of the car without another word, and Ryan and I drove off toward my place. The streetlights seemed to flicker as we passed under, them casting an eerie, rhythmic glow across the road. I could barely hold my eyes open. My body was exhausted, every muscle aching from the tension. But I still felt a tightness in my chest, a sense of unease that wouldn't let go. It wasn't over. The thought echoed through my mind like a drumbeat, and I couldn't shake it. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind still reeling from the terror of the weekend, but I knew better. I knew deep down that we hadn't left the woods behind. It had followed us. Whatever it was, whatever force was out there in the trees, it wasn't going to let us go that easily. When I got home, I sat in my car for a long while, staring at the empty street ahead. My apartment seemed far away, distant, as if the world had tilted, and I was still caught in the gravity of what we had experienced. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the urge to go inside won out. I grabbed my things and dragged myself up the stairs, trying to keep my mind focused on the simple task of unlocking the door, of getting inside and pretending that everything was normal again. It wasn't until I was in my living room collapsing on the couch that I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. I reached for it, my hands trembling, and opened the messages. It was from Ryan. "Dude, the door was open." That was all it said. No explanation, no details, just those words, hanging in the air like a question. The door. Open. I knew exactly what he meant. I looked around the apartment, the silence now oppressive. The room felt too still, like it was holding its breath, just like the cabin had been. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to be too thick in the corners, too dark to be natural. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, and I couldn't stop the rising dread from taking over. I reached for the phone again and started scrolling through the pictures we had taken at the cabin. It was stupid. I knew it was stupid, but I couldn't help it. I had to see it. I had to understand what we had missed. And that's when I found it. A photo of Mia and Jake, smiling half-heartedly in front of the cabin, a weak attempt at normalcy after everything we'd gone through. But something was wrong. In the background, the porch was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, and standing just behind them, barely perceptible in the dark, was a pale figure with long, bony fingers curled around the railing. It was there. It was in the picture, and it was still with us. My breath caught in my throat. I scrolled to the next photo, and the next, each one worse than the last. In every shot I could see it, hiding just out of frame, watching us, its presence growing more pronounced with each passing image. It had been there all along, always just beyond the edge of the light, always waiting. I couldn't stay here. Grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted out the door. My mind was spinning. I had to get to Ryan, we had to leave. I couldn't be here anymore, not with whatever was lurking in the dark corners of my home. I ran down the stairs, across the street, and toward the parking lot. I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and just as I was about to unlock it, I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. On my apartment door. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and my blood ran cold. The door was wide open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the pale figure. Its fingers curled around the frame, its mouth open wide in a twisted, predatory grin. It was here. It had followed me, and it wasn't letting me go. I remember the night I first moved into apartment 6D at Blackthorn Heights like it was yesterday. It was late in the evening when I finally unloaded the last of my boxes and settled into my new home. I'd been looking for a place to call my own for months, and when I found this old building in Portland, I couldn't pass it up. The rent was cheap, and despite its age, it felt like the kind of place where I could focus on my photography, get away from the world, and figure things out. The hallway was narrow, the floors creaked underfoot, and there was a musty smell in the air, but none of that bothered me. It had character, which was exactly what I was looking for. The apartment itself was small but cozy, a perfect space for a single person. It had hardwood floors, a small kitchen, and a view of the street below. The walls were painted a faded yellow, and there was a large window in the living room that let in the afternoon sun. But what I remember most was the silence. It wasn't the usual peace I associated with living alone. It was a heavy kind of silence, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. As I unpacked my things, I came across a stack of old letters and papers left behind by the previous tenant, an elderly woman named Agnes Moore. She had lived here for decades, and according to the landlord, she'd passed away quietly of a stroke just a month before I moved in. But the last few pieces of paper I found in the stack caught my attention, a journal, its pages yellowed and worn. The final entry read, "It stands in the corner every night, it's getting closer." At the time, I didn't think much of it. People get paranoid when they're alone too much, right? The last few months of my life had been nothing but moving from one place to another, trying to get my freelance photography career off the ground, so I figured it was just an old woman's ramblings. Besides, I wasn't exactly new to the weird. I'd heard all sorts of strange things about old buildings in my time. Nothing to be worried about. I finished unpacking around 10:30 p.m. and made myself a quick dinner. As I sat down to eat, the building creaked and groaned around me, but that was to be expected. The air in the apartment was a little cooler than usual, but nothing I couldn't handle. I chalked it up to the old heating system and the fact that it had rained all day. It wasn't until after dinner that things started to feel off. I was sitting in the living room flipping through my camera gear when I noticed it, a faint flicker from the digital clock on the wall. The numbers glitched for a split second, then stabilized, but that brief moment of interruption was enough to set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just a power surge, but then it happened again, and this time, I felt it. The air in the room turned icy, far colder than it had been before. It wasn't just the temperature, though, it was the sensation of being watched. Something was in the room with me, but when I glanced around, there was nothing there. The room was empty, just me, sitting on the couch, staring at the clock, and then I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from the hallway. "Lena." I froze, my heart pounding. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe someone walking down the hallway outside. The building was old, the walls thin, but the whisper didn't stop. It was my name, clear and distinct, and it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from just outside my bedroom door. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the door. The hallway outside was dark and still. No one was there. I checked the locks on the door, then the windows, but everything was in place. I even stepped out into the hallway thinking maybe it had been a sound from one of the other apartments, but no one was around. No sounds, no footsteps, just the silence of the building. When I returned to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off, tell myself I was just tired, but I couldn't ignore the chill in the air. It was colder now, almost unbearable. I went to bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scratching noise. Soft at first, just a slight tap against the walls. Then it grew louder. Scratching, dragging, something moving inside the walls, as if claws were scraping along the plaster. I sat up in bed, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, and looked around the room. The shadows were long, stretching across the floor as the moonlight filtered through the window. The scratching sound continued, a slow, deliberate drag, coming from the walls on the far side of the room. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and checked the time. 3:17 a.m. The same time the clock had glitched earlier. I turned on the lamp beside my bed, hoping the light would bring some comfort, but the shadows seemed to deepen instead. The room felt even colder now, as if the air had frozen solid. And then, just as I was about to reach for the phone to call someone, a sudden gust of wind slammed the window shut, startling me. The light flickered violently. Something was in the room with me. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else. And I wasn't alone. The days that followed that first night in apartment 6D were a blur, each one feeling like a continuation of the last. After the whispering voice, the flickering lights, and the unnerving cold, I thought I had seen the worst of it. I convinced myself that it was just the building's age playing tricks on me. The combination of old wiring, drafty windows, and maybe a bit too much stress from moving and starting over. I had to. I couldn't afford to let myself spiral into paranoia. But then, things started happening that I couldn't explain away so easily. The first incident was subtle. A chair in the kitchen pulled out from the table. I was certain I had left it in place when I'd sat down for breakfast, but when I returned to the room, it was positioned a foot away from the table. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to piece together what had happened. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assuming I had somehow moved it myself without remembering. But as the days went on, more things began to shift, each one just a little more disturbing than the last. One afternoon, I returned from an errand to find my couch cushions indented as though someone had been sitting there, pressing down hard enough to leave a mark. I hadn't even sat down that day. I ran my fingers along the fabric, tracing the deep impressions, the fabric cool against my skin. I thought maybe it was just the weird way old furniture sometimes settles, but the feeling in my stomach, an uncomfortable twisting, told me otherwise. That night, the temperature dropped suddenly, far colder than it should have been. I had turned the thermostat up to a comfortable 72 degrees when I'd left for the grocery store, but when I returned, it was as though winter had gripped the apartment. The air was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light of the hallway. I rubbed my arms, trying to warm up, but it felt like the chill was coming from inside the walls. I searched the apartment for drafts, checking windows, doors, and the heater, but everything seemed fine. The only thing out of the ordinary was the temperature. I turned on a space heater in the living room, hoping to warm the place up, but the room refused to warm at all. I tried to rationalize it. The building was old after all. Maybe the pipes were acting up. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The noises continued too. At first, it was a soft scratching sound, almost like someone running their nails across a chalkboard. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to settling pipes or the building's age. But soon the scratching became more insistent, louder, more deliberate. It came from the walls. Every night, at exactly the same time, 3:17 a.m., the noise would start. It was always in the same spot, the farthest corner of my bedroom, behind the wall closest to the street. At first it was so faint I thought it was just the wind. But it didn't stop. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the clock, watching the seconds tick by. I'd close my eyes, hoping to drift off to sleep, but every time I did, the scratching would start. Sometimes I'd get up and check the wall, running my hand along the surface, feeling the cold plaster beneath my fingertips. There was nothing. No sign of anything that could be causing the sound, yet it was always there, persistent, like someone, or something, was trapped inside the walls, clawing its way out. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my phone and called my best friend, Sarah. "Lena? It's almost 2 a.m. "What's wrong?" She answered groggily. "I don't know what to do." "I think I'm losing it," I said, my voice shaking. "The noises, they're coming from inside the walls, and the temperature drops like a switch has been flipped." "Maybe you're just stressed out," she suggested. "Have you been sleeping at all? It could be affecting your mind." "I don't know, Sarah," I said, pacing the apartment, my eyes darting toward the corners. "It feels wrong. I can't explain it. The air is thick, like something's here, watching me." "You're being paranoid," she said, though I could hear the unease in her voice. "Just get some sleep, okay? You need rest." "Everything sounds fine." I ended the call without another word. I didn't want her to hear how scared I really was. She couldn't understand. She had never experienced something like this. The next morning I woke up late, the sun casting a dim light through the blinds. The apartment felt quieter, but not in a peaceful way. The silence was suffocating. It was as though the walls were pressing in on me. As I got out of bed and moved toward the kitchen, I noticed something strange on the bedroom door. 3 deep gouges had appeared, as though something had raked its claws down the surface. The marks were fresh, the edges jagged and raw. I stood there, staring at the scratches, my pulse racing. There was no way I could have done that, no way anyone could have. I had been asleep, alone, in the apartment when it happened. I tried to push the panic down, to focus on the practical. I grabbed a cup of coffee, hoping the caffeine would steady my nerves, but as I took my first sip, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room had gone cold again, despite the heat still running. I pulled the collar of my sweater tighter around my neck and glanced toward the hallway. Something was watching me. It wasn't the usual feeling of being observed from the corner of my eye, as though someone was standing just out of sight. It was different. It was deeper, more visceral. I could feel its presence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't escape. I didn't know what to do anymore. The apartment was becoming a prison. Each night it was the same. The sounds, the shadows, the cold. I had tried everything, burning sage, putting salt by the door, even sleeping with a Bible under my pillow. Nothing worked. And the worst part? No one would believe me. Everyone would think I was just overworked, exhausted, or losing my mind. But I wasn't. I knew something was here, it was waiting, and I was running out of time. I had tried everything on my own, and yet the apartment seemed to grow worse each passing day. I felt trapped in an endless cycle of fear and desperation. I didn't know who else to turn to. The noises had escalated, the shadow had become more tangible, and the cold was an ever-present companion. But what could I do? Everyone I spoke to dismissed my fears as anxiety or stress. I had even gone so far as to contact the landlord to see if I could get out of my lease early. He only offered a weak apology and said he hadn't heard of anything unusual in the building before. "It's just an old building, Lena," he'd said. "It makes noises sometimes." But I knew better. I could feel it. Something was there. And I knew I wasn't crazy. A week into the worst of it, my best friend Sarah finally convinced me to see someone, a medium. She had done some research, found a woman named Madame Vasquez, who had a reputation for dealing with paranormal phenomena. Sarah spoke highly of her, saying she had helped a few people she knew, though part of me was still skeptical. I didn't believe in psychics or mediums, but at that point, I had nothing left to lose. I made the call. The appointment was set for the following Wednesday, the day after I found the deep gouges on my bedroom door. I had hardly slept the night before, as the scratching came more frequently and the whispers grew louder. The air felt heavier in the apartment, as though it was pulling me under. When Madame Vasquez arrived, I could already sense something different about her. She didn't look like the psychics you see in movies or on TV. No beads, no over-the-top spiritual aura. She was just a woman in her 50s, wearing a simple black dress and a soft, serious expression. Her hair was neatly pinned back, and her eyes were sharp as if she could see right through me. She entered the apartment with a quick glance around, then turned to me. "You can't feel it, can you?" she asked. "Not like I can." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Her expression softened. "The presence in this apartment, it's old. Ancient, even. It's not just a ghost, Lena. It's something else. Something hungry. It's been here for a long time." Her words chilled me. The feeling in my chest tightened like my heart was being squeezed. "Show me where you feel it most," she said. Her voice was calm but authoritative. I led her through the apartment, walking first to the kitchen where I had found the strange chair movement and the cold that always seemed to hit first. But when she stepped inside, she froze. Her hand went to her mouth as if she had just smelled something foul. "Not here," she murmured, shaking her head. She looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief, then moved on to the living room where the temperature fluctuated wildly, and then to the hallway where the scratching came from. But it was the bedroom that really caught her attention. "Here," she said quietly, standing just inside the doorway. "This is where it's the strongest. I can feel it." I felt an electric buzz on my skin as she walked further into the room. She didn't touch anything. No pictures, no bedspread, just an air of concentration that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. She stopped near the far wall, the exact spot where I had heard the scratching every night. "I know you've been trying to fight it," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper now. "But whatever this is, it's been feeding off your fear. It's not going to leave unless you force it to. And there's only one way to do that." I swallowed, fighting the lump in my throat. "How? What do I have to do?" She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes dark and intense. "You need to confront it. Head on. Demand it leave. If you don't, it will only get stronger. It feeds off your fear. It wants to control you." Her words sent a wave of dread through me. I felt my legs weaken, and I had to sit down. Confront it? How was I supposed to do that? "Let me explain something to you," Madame Vasquez said. Her voice, gentle now, but with an underlying firmness. "The entity in your apartment is not a simple ghost. It is older, darker than that. It might have been tied to this building for decades. It has latched onto you because you're vulnerable, because you're alone. It feeds off isolation, fear, and despair." I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "So, what, I'm just supposed to shout at it? Demand it leave?" "Not just shout," she replied. "You must speak with conviction. Your fear feeds it, Lena. You have to stand your ground. And it might fight back. It will not want to. Go easily." A cold shiver crawled down my spine as I remembered the whispers. The cold breath. The way I had felt its presence following me. It sounded impossible. But the dread inside me felt very real. And deep down, I knew I had no other choice. Madame Vasquez left me with a warning before she departed. "Remember this, Lena. If you do not confront it, it will eventually consume you. It will take everything you are piece by piece until you're nothing but a shell." That night, I decided I had nothing left to lose. I would confront whatever was in my apartment, whatever had been haunting me. I couldn't let it take any more of me. But as I stood in the center of my living room, waiting for the darkness to fully settle, I realized something. This thing, this force, wasn't just a shadow, it was waiting. It had been waiting for me to give up, and that realization, more than anything, was what filled me with the courage I needed. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I stood tall facing the hallway where I always felt the presence the strongest. I took a deep breath. I was tired. Tired of being afraid, tired of hiding. And then I shouted, "Leave, now!" The temperature dropped like a stone. The lights flickered, buzzing overhead. And then something moved in the darkness. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every nerve in my body alert, waiting for some sort of response. The cold in the room was suffocating, like it was alive and swirling around me. I had seen it before. The shadow in the corner, the flickers of movement just beyond the range of my vision. But tonight felt different. It felt closer. The air had thickened, and the silence that followed my command was deafening. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe a cold gust of wind or the slamming of a door. But what happened next was worse than I could have imagined. The lights above me flickered once more, then went out entirely. In the pitch darkness, my breath became visible, hanging in the air like mist. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer from the hallway. Every footstep echoed in the heavy silence, sending a shiver of dread through my spine. The sound was unmistakable. I was no longer alone. I gripped the edge of the coffee table for support, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The whispers began again, low and guttural, like they were coming from inside my own head. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice hissed. It was wrong. Too deep, too harsh to be human. The shadow, now far more distinct, began to form at the end of the hallway, stretching out from the corner where the light couldn't quite reach. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was fluid, almost like it was made of smoke or shifting darkness. The closer it came, the heavier the air felt, as if it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wasn't sure if I was hallucinating, or if the fear was making me see things, but I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread and cold, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. The shadow moved toward me, and I instinctively took a step back. My hands trembled, but I steadied myself, forcing my voice to remain firm. "Leave. You are not welcome here," I demanded again, louder this time, trying to muster any semblance of authority over my own fear. But the shadow didn't stop. It kept coming, the air thickening with its presence, pulling the warmth from the room like a vacuum. I could feel it pressing against me, hear the whispering growing louder, swirling around me. Closer, closer. It was no longer a distant figure. In the corner of my eye, it was here, right in front of me. I could see its shape more clearly now. Long limbs, impossibly thin, and its face, or what I assumed was a face, was just a hollow, dark void. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt like I was being pulled into that void, like my own identity was being erased by its very existence. Then, without warning, it spoke. A voice that was as cold and brittle as the winter winds outside, yet somehow intimately familiar. "You cannot escape me. You never could." The room felt like it was closing in around me, and for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. The words made no sense. I had no idea what it was talking about, but the certainty in its voice made me freeze. In terror, my limbs went numb as if my body was rejecting the idea of facing this thing. But then I remembered Madame Vasquez's words, "You have to confront it. It feeds off your fear." "Get out," I shouted, the command coming from somewhere deep inside me, a voice that didn't tremble. I didn't know if it was the exhaustion or the sheer terror I'd been holding on to for weeks, but I found something in me, something strong. "Leave now, or I'll make you." The shadow paused. I could feel it pause, as if it were considering me. There was an overwhelming sense of cold, and then a flicker of movement. In a split second, the shadow lunged toward me. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I felt the cold penetrate my skin, my bones, until I could barely breathe. I gasped, reaching for anything to hold on to. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I backed away, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed me up. I felt it around me, suffocating, wrapping its cold fingers around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I was drowning in the dark. My heart raced, panic overtaking me. But then the strange, gut-wrenching feeling of powerlessness lifted. Something inside me snapped. I realized I wasn't just fighting this thing physically. I was fighting it mentally. It fed off my fear, off my doubts. I had to fight it the only way I could, by refusing to be afraid any longer. With every ounce of strength I had left, I took a step forward, facing the shadow head-on, despite the fear clawing at my insides. "I'm not afraid of you," I spat, my voice trembling but stronger now, and I believed it. The shadow recoiled. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it faltering. The air began to warm again, and the oppressive weight in the room lifted, just a fraction. I took another step forward, and the shadow retreated. "You are nothing," I shouted, feeling my confidence grow. "You're a trick, a parasite, and you will leave." I didn't know if I was imagining it, but the shadow seemed to shrink, its form dissipating like smoke when the wind blows it away. The temperature in the room gradually returned to normal. I felt the oppressive weight of the darkness lift entirely, replaced by a cold emptiness where it had been. And then, as quickly as it had come, the shadow was gone. The air felt different, lighter. The room was still cold, but it was no longer suffocating. The whispers had stopped. There was only silence. I stood there for a long time, breathing heavily, my chest tight with adrenaline and fear. I didn't know if I had truly won, but something had changed. The oppressive presence was gone, and for the first time in weeks I felt safe. But deep down I knew the battle wasn't over. The shadow was gone, for now. But the terror of what it had been, what it had tried to do to me, would linger forever. And, in the back of my mind, I heard its voice once more. "You can't escape me." But this time it didn't sound as certain. The battle was over. But the war? That had just begun. It's strange, isn't it? The way fear lingers after the danger has passed. When everything quiets down, and the immediate threat vanishes, you'd think the relief would settle in fully, but it doesn't. It never really does. Not when something like this happens. For the next few days after that night, I lived in a kind of numbness. The shadow had gone. That much was clear. I felt it. No more whispers, no more bone-chilling cold. The apartment, which had once been filled with an oppressive, suffocating air, now seemed almost normal. Almost. I didn't know what I was expecting to happen when I confronted it. Maybe I thought it would burn away in the light, that the power of my defiance would end it all. But that wasn't the case. I could still feel it there beneath the surface of my thoughts, waiting for an opening. The shadow had been a manifestation of something deeper, something older, something that thrived on fear and uncertainty. And while I had managed to silence it for now, I knew it hadn't disappeared completely. The days that followed were filled with an uncomfortable quiet. I went about my life trying to ignore the creeping sensation that something was still watching. I moved the furniture around, opened the windows wide to let in fresh air, even redecorated the living room. Anything to make the apartment feel less like it had been. But no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to make the apartment feel like a home again, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, checking the corners of rooms before entering them, certain that the shadow, it, was hiding just out of sight, waiting for the moment when I'd let my guard down. I'd wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart hammering in my chest. Sometimes I would lie there for hours, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing in on me. I couldn't help but listen for any sound, any sign that it had returned. But it never did. Or so I thought. It was 3 weeks after that night, the night I'd stood my ground, that I made a discovery. I woke up early one morning, the sunlight just beginning to filter through the blinds. The apartment was quiet, the normal quiet I had grown used to in the last few weeks. I moved to get up, but something caught my eye. The bedroom mirror. It was cracked. Not the kind of crack from a fall or a bump, but a line that ran across the glass, jagged and unnatural. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. How had that happened? I hadn't touched it in weeks. In fact, I hadn't even looked at it in days. And then I saw it. A faint distortion, a dark patch right in the center of the mirror, like a shadow shifting just out of my direct line of sight. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking it was some trick of the light. But when I looked again, I saw it more clearly. There, just in the corner, was the faintest outline of something, someone, standing in the reflection. I could see only the outline, but it was unmistakable. It was tall, thin, with an unholy hollow shape that made my blood run cold. I staggered backward, my breath coming fast. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat broke out on my brow. The shadow, it hadn't left me. It had just been waiting. Suddenly I felt like I was suffocating again, that horrible pressure returning. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, my camera, and turned it on the mirror, snapping a shot. The flash was blinding, and for a moment I thought I saw it move, the shadow, stretching toward me. But when I looked at the image, I was horrified to see something else entirely. In the reflection of the mirror, the figure wasn't just a shadow. It was me. I blinked hard. My mind spun. How could that be? The reflection was still in the corner, still watching, but now the outline was clearer, sharper, and it wasn't just some vague figure. I could see my own features, distorted, darkened, twisted with the same hollow emptiness I'd seen in the shadow. I stumbled backward, the camera slipping from my hands. My pulse raced, my breath quickening, and in the cold silence, I heard the whispers again. This time they were clearer than ever, echoing in my mind, "You can't escape, you're just like me now. We are the same." I bolted for the door, panic overwhelming me. But before I could reach it, something stopped me. An invisible force, like an unseen hand on my chest pushing me back. I gasped, struggling to breathe as the room seemed to close in. Then I understood. The shadow hadn't been trying to consume me. It had been trying to merge with me. In that moment, I realized what had been happening all along. It wasn't just an entity haunting me. It was a part of me, a part of my own fear, my own doubts. I had brought it into existence. I had let it grow, feeding it with my own insecurities and terror. And now, it was becoming me. In a daze, I ran to the door and flung it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I left the apartment and never returned. But the shadow I know now didn't just stay behind. It followed me. I see it now, in the corner of my vision, in mirrors, in the dark, even when I'm wide awake. It's always there, just out of reach, waiting, watching. It's only a matter of time before it takes me completely. Maybe it already has. And if you're ever in Portland, walking down Blackthorn Heights and you happen to glance up at the apartment windows, you might see something strange in the reflection. A woman with dark eyes, her face pale and featureless, standing just behind the glass. Just a shadow in the corner. But no matter how you look at it, she won't be leaving. I didn't expect to find much when I moved into Unit 4B of the Holloway Arms. It was the summer of 2018, and after months of rejection letters and scraping by with freelance work, I was desperate. Chicago was a city full of ambition, but not much patience. The Holloway Arms was one of those buildings that had seen better days. I could tell as soon as I walked in that it wasn't a place anyone moved into for comfort. The building was old, pre-war, the super had told me when he handed me the keys, and it had that unmistakable smell of aged wood and damp concrete. The walls were chipped, the floors creaked beneath my feet, and the hallway had a faint, musty odor that even the cheapest air freshener couldn't mask. But I was desperate, and this apartment was cheap. Mr. Driscoll, the super, was a gaunt man, a bit older than I expected, but that's not unusual for building superintendents. He barely spoke when he handed me the keys. His skin was too pale, his clothes too ill-fitting. There was a strange tension in the air around him, as if he wasn't entirely present. As I took the keys from him, he gave me a long, unreadable look. "Don't mind the noises. he said, his voice low. Old pipes, they creak. I nodded politely, not thinking much of it. What could be the worst thing about old pipes? I had my doubts, but I was so tired of being out of work that I didn't care if the walls whispered at night. Anything to get a place of my own. The apartment itself wasn't terrible. The kitchen had a small stove. The fridge was on the old side, but it worked. The bathroom had the usual small clawfoot tub and stained tiles. I could make it work. After all, I wasn't here for the amenities. I just needed space to write. It wasn't until I moved in and started talking to the neighbors that I learned about Lillian Graves, the tenant before me. Lillian had been a pianist, I was told, a reclusive artist who had lived in 4B for years. But her behavior had grown erratic before she died. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones about her as if they feared mentioning her name out loud. She had been a quiet woman, kept to herself for the most part. But then one day they said she started hearing things. Whispers, they told me. Low, voices coming from nowhere. A man's voice, always the same. He's coming for me. That's what Lillian had said in the days before her death. I felt a slight chill crawl up my spine as they spoke. But it didn't matter. The previous tenant wasn't my problem. People leave apartments for all sorts of reasons, right? The police had ruled her death as an accident, something about slipping in the tub. But when I checked the super's log, something strange stood out. Under tenant complaints, in Mr. Driscoll's shaky handwriting, there was a note. Tenant complained of the whispering man before incident. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was still new to the building, still settling in. I figured it was just another strange part of apartment life. Weird noises, strange neighbors, nothing out of the ordinary. Or so I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, I could hear it. At first, I thought it was the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling. But then it came again. A low, distant murmur like a whisper just out of reach. I pressed my ear to the pillow, trying to block it out, but the sound persisted. It was as if someone was in the room with me. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or the pipes, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. A voice, muffled but insistent. He's coming. I shivered and pulled the covers up over my head, trying to ignore the feeling that had settled deep in my chest. He's coming. It was faint, but unmistakable. I'd never been one to believe in ghosts. Not really. But I couldn't deny the feeling creeping up my spine. Lillian's whispers, the odd note in Mr. Driscoll's log, and now this. It was enough to make me wonder if I had made a huge mistake. I didn't sleep much that night, and I didn't sleep much the next night either. Or the next. The whispers didn't stop. At first, I chalked up the weird things happening to the usual quirks of an old apartment. Things get moved around, pipes groan, the creaks and cracks of old wood and brick settling. It's not uncommon. But the longer I stayed in Unit 4B, the harder it became to dismiss what was happening. It started with my favorite mug. It wasn't a valuable thing, just a chipped blue mug I'd gotten from a secondhand shop. But I loved it. Every morning, I'd make coffee in it, sitting at the small kitchen table while I checked emails or scribbled notes for my book. One morning I woke up, groggy from lack of sleep, and stumbled into the kitchen to make my usual cup. I reached into the cupboard for my mug, but it wasn't there. I looked again, expecting to find it on the counter, or perhaps near the sink. But it was gone. After a few minutes of searching, I found it. It was sitting on the coffee table in the living room, perfectly positioned, almost like someone had placed it there intentionally. I thought maybe I had moved it the night before without realizing it, but I didn't remember doing that. It wasn't a big deal, so I let it go. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But it wasn't the last time something would be out of place. A few days later, my notebooks started showing up in places they shouldn't be. I kept them on the shelf next to my desk, organized by date and chapter. I had a system, even if it was a bit haphazard. But one afternoon, I sat down to write, and noticed a notebook had been pulled off the shelf and opened on the couch. The pages inside were covered in strange childlike scribbles, figures drawn in black ink, tall and thin with hollow eyes. I had no memory of writing them, no recollection of ever sketching anything like it. At first I thought it was just another weird thing. Maybe I had absent-mindedly doodled while I was working, but it didn't feel like that. These weren't my drawings. They weren't my words. The figure in the sketch had an unnatural, unsettling quality, like it didn't belong on the page at all. The next morning, I woke to find something even stranger. My typewriter, a relic I had inherited from a friend, sat on the desk, a half-written manuscript still inserted into it. I hadn't touched the typewriter in days, and I never left it on. But there it was, the keys pressed deep into the paper, typing out the same phrase over and over again. He watches you sleep. I stared at the paper, my blood running cold. The typewriter was old, yes, but it had never typed on its own. I felt a tightness in my chest, a sinking feeling. How had it done this? How had the paper been typed when I hadn't even touched it? I picked up the page, my hands shaking, and immediately crumpled it into a ball. I had to get rid of it. I threw it into the trash, but even after I did, the words felt like they were still hovering in the air, hanging there like a whisper that wouldn't leave. By the next night, the noises had grown more frequent. At exactly 3 a.m., the walls would hum with whispers again, the same voices, the same hushed murmurs. They weren't even coherent words at first, just sounds, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the plaster. I pressed my ear to the wall once, trying to hear more clearly. But the moment I did, the whispers stopped. Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. It happened again the next night. And the next. At first, it was just unsettling. But then, one night, it changed. I woke up to 3 sharp knocks coming from my closet. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the normal creak of the building or the sound of something settling. It was deliberate, like someone was knocking from the inside, trying to get out. I sat, up in bed, my heart racing. I tried to rationalize it. Pipes, wind, something outside. But I knew deep down it wasn't that. It was too specific, too intentional. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing more. The knocking didn't come again. I lay back down, shaking slightly, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. The same feeling that had been building in the apartment, that something was watching me, was now inescapable. I didn't go near the closet for the rest of the night, and for the first time since moving in, I slept with the lights on. I kept telling myself that it was all just my imagination, just the exhaustion of moving into a new place, maybe a bit of stress from the writing deadlines. But the feeling, the sense that something was wrong, that something was inside the walls with me, wouldn't go away, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. When I ran into Mrs. Calderon, the woman who lived 2 doors down, she mentioned the noises in the walls too. She spoke of the tapping and the whispers, but she didn't mention anything specific. When I asked if she knew about the previous tenant, Lillian Graves, her eyes grew wide, and she quickly changed the subject, as if the name alone was enough to make her uncomfortable. I could sense the same fear that had gripped me. The Holloway Arms wasn't just an old building. It was something else, something darker, and I was starting to feel like the longer I stayed, the closer I came to something I wasn't ready to understand. The next day, I decided to visit the super. Maybe he could explain the noises, the strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched. I wasn't sure what I expected from Mr. Driscoll, but when I arrived at his office, he barely looked up from his desk as I entered. "Everything all right in your apartment?" he asked, his voice flat, not meeting my eyes. "Actually," I started, my voice shaking just slightly, "I've been hearing some strange noises, and some of my things, my notebooks, my typewriter, they've been moving. I don't know how to explain it." He paused, his fingers pressing together as if he were considering whether to say anything more. Then he looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Don't mind the noises, old pipes," he said, repeating his earlier comment from the day I moved in. But there was something in his expression now, something that told me he wasn't as indifferent as he had seemed. His eyes flicked nervously toward the door as if making sure no one else was listening. "I didn't warn you about the others," he muttered quietly. "People get funny in that apartment. You're not the first to notice things. The last tenant, Lillian Graves, complained about someone. She said it was a man. She never saw him, but she heard him, waiting." His words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing on me, and I could feel my stomach drop. "The whispering man?" I asked, though it came out more like a statement than a question. Mr. Driscoll looked down, sighing deeply. "Yes, that's the one. But I didn't want to scare you. It's just an old building, Maya. Old buildings carry stories with them. Stories people can't forget." I left his office with a knot in my stomach, the feeling of being watched now suffocating, and I realized as I walked back to my apartment that it wasn't just the pipes or the creaky floors. Something else was here. Something that had been here long before me. And I wasn't sure I could leave without it following me. I didn't know what had pushed me to keep going, to stay in that apartment after everything that had happened. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the hope that whatever was happening was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I told myself that I would get used to it, that eventually the noises would stop, that the whispers would fade, and that the strange happenings were nothing more than the quirks of an old building. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. It had been weeks since I first moved in, and every night the atmosphere in the apartment grew thicker, more suffocating. The noises were more persistent now, more tangible. The whispering voices would fill the air at exactly 3 a.m., their indecipherable murmurs crawling under my skin. I'd press my ear against the wall and try to hear more clearly, but the moment I did, the whispering would stop, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat in the silence. The typewriter kept typing too. The first time it happened, I thought it was some weird mechanical glitch, but now it was becoming a pattern. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of keys tapping, over and over again, each keystroke deliberate and unnerving. Every time I checked the paper, it was the same phrase etched into the page as if something, was trying to make me understand it. "He watches you sleep." The words seemed to mock me, as if they were always just one step ahead of me, drawing me deeper into whatever was happening. I could never get the typewriter to stop once it started. It was as if it had a mind of its own. I had even tried disconnecting it, hoping that would stop the eerie messages, but the next morning it would be back on, keys pressed into the paper again, the same chilling words waiting for me. But the worst part of it all came one night when the power went out. It was just past midnight when the lights flickered and then went completely dark, leaving me in a cold, thick silence. I didn't panic right away. The building was old, and power outages weren't uncommon, especially with all the rain we'd been having. But as I got out of bed and fumbled for the flashlight in my drawer, something felt different. The air was heavier, thick with an almost suffocating weight. I walked into the living room, trying to keep calm, but the flickering flashlight cast long shadows across the room, stretching unnaturally along the walls. I felt a strange tightness in my chest. That feeling of being watched, always there but never fully acknowledged, was overwhelming now. That's when I felt it. A cold, skeletal hand dragging down my spine. The nails were cracked, jagged as if they had been worn down over time. It was a sensation so vivid, so real, that I gasped aloud, a sharp, involuntary breath escaping my lips. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see. Just the empty space around me, stretching out in every direction. But I could feel it. It was as though the hand had been real, had brushed against me, its touch lingering in the air. The smell hit me next. Wet wool and rotting teeth. The pungent odor of decay. I recoiled, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but the air was too thick, too heavy, and I couldn't force the words out. I ran to the bathroom, hoping the water would calm me down, hoping I could wash away the feeling that had settled into my skin. But as I flicked on the bathroom light and stared into the mirror, I froze. There, in the fog on the glass, something had been written. At first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, the result of my overwhelming fear. But when I looked closer, I saw the words, perfectly clear. Lillian didn't fight either. My breath hitched in my throat. The words seemed to burn into the glass, etched there as if they had been written just for me. I could feel my stomach churn as I backed away from the mirror. The smell of decay lingered, thick and sour, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. I turned away from the mirror, running to the living room, my body trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just my imagination. I had been living in this apartment for weeks now, and the strange occurrences had only escalated. The whispers, the typewriter messages, the feeling of being touched by something I couldn't see. It was all real. It had to be. And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. The previous tenant, Lillian Graves, the super's log, the notes about the whispering man. Everything started to fall into place. Lillian's death wasn't an accident. She hadn't just slipped in the tub. She had been driven mad. Maybe by the same thing that was tormenting me now. The whispers, the presence in the walls, the unseen hand reaching out for her. It was the same thing I was feeling, the same thing I had been feeling since I moved. I couldn't stay here anymore. I knew that now. The apartment had taken everything from Lillian, and it was taking everything from me too. Whatever was inside these walls had claimed her, and it was going to claim me next if I didn't do something about it. I made the decision right then and there. I had to leave. But as I reached for my phone to call a friend, something stopped. Me, the knocking. 3 loud raps echoed from inside the closet. 3 like the ones I had heard before, the ones that had started it all. I turned toward the closet, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to open it, but the knocking grew louder, more urgent. 3 raps. I had to know. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the closet door. And just as I pulled it open, a blast of cold air rushed out, and the light flickered back on, casting long shadows on the walls. But there was nothing in the closet. Only the familiar mess of clothes hanging from hangers and the empty space where my things had been tossed around. I laughed, a nervous, shaky laugh, and closed the door, but the whispers came back. The knocking stopped, and the voices from inside the walls rose again, louder now. I stood there in the silence, my body frozen with fear, and I realized something. Whatever had been here before me, whatever had followed Lillian, wasn't done. Yet it wasn't done with me. I couldn't stay. I wouldn't stay. But I knew as I packed up the last of my things that this place had already claimed me. It had claimed my fear, my thoughts. And soon I knew it would claim my soul too. The Holloway Arms wasn't finished with me yet. And as I left the apartment behind, I could hear it, faint but clear, the sound of someone laughing. I thought that leaving would be the answer, that the moment I walked out of the Holloway Arms, it would all fade. Whatever malevolent presence had settled in that place would be left behind in the walls. But the truth was, no matter how much I packed, no matter how many doors I slammed shut behind me, I couldn't escape what had followed me. It was still there, in the back of my mind, in the deep recesses of the apartment, in the air that clung to my skin. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The weight of what I'd just been through pressed down on me. I stayed up pacing in my temporary apartment, trying to calm my nerves, but the whispering, the thought of it, never left me. The more I thought about the warning, in the foggy mirror, the more certain I became that I hadn't just been hearing things. It wasn't just my imagination running wild. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but I could feel it. Something had been there before me, something that was still there, waiting for me to make a mistake. The next morning, after an entire night of restless thinking, I knew I had to do something. I had to face it. Running wasn't the solution. It never had been. That's when I called Father Ruiz. Father Ruiz was a local paranormal investigator, a priest by day, a man who specialized in spiritual disturbances by night. He had helped several people in the area with situations like mine, offering blessings and guidance for those who believed they were dealing with more than just a bad apartment. I'd heard of him through word of mouth, mostly from the same neighbors who had mentioned Lillian Graves, but I had never really believed in what he did. Not until now. I told him everything I had experienced, the whispers, the knocking, the visions that had taunted me in my apartment. I could hear the quiet understanding in his voice when he spoke, and when he said, "I'll be there." I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Father Ruiz arrived in the early afternoon. I met him outside the building, and the moment I saw him, I knew I wasn't going to get out of this easily. He wasn't the typical priest you might imagine. No flowing robes or stiff, solemn expression. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a simple black sweater and jeans, his face kind but worn. There was a tiredness in his eyes, something that made me think he had seen things I could never even imagine. "Ms. Vasquez," he greeted me, shaking my hand with a firm, reassuring grip. "I understand you've been having some trouble." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I led him inside, up the stairs to my old apartment, and as we stepped into the hallway, I could feel the air shift. The temperature seemed to drop, just like it always had in the building. The walls creaked underfoot, and the weight of something unseen seemed to press against me as I fumbled with the keys. Father Ruiz didn't say anything, but he was looking around, his eyes scanning the hall. He seemed to sense it, too. He had been here before. This wasn't his first time dealing with something like this. The apartment was just as I had left it, empty, desolate, the shadows long across the floor. There was still a sense of foreboding. In the air, the familiar chill that had never quite gone away. He moved through the space quietly, touching the door frames, crossing himself as he made his way into each room. When he reached the bedroom, he paused, his hand resting against the door frame. "This is where it's centered," he said, more to himself than to me. "The energy here is strong, almost like a wound that hasn't healed." I nodded, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. "I've felt it. It's like it's always watching me." Father Ruiz turned to me then, his expression softening. "Whatever this is, it has been here a long time. The house, the building, it's a vessel for something darker. But the presence here, it's attached itself to you." I stiffened, the words hitting me harder than I had expected. "What do you mean?" I whispered. "It means you are marked, Maya. And the longer you stayed here, the more it latched onto you. But it can be removed," he added quickly, seeing the fear in my face. "I can help you." I felt a strange combination of relief and terror. Could it really be that simple? Could someone like him, someone who believed in things I didn't understand, really remove whatever had been haunting me? "We need to search the apartment," Father Ruiz said, turning to examine the walls. "The energy is trapped. Whatever happened to the last tenant, it left something behind, something that shouldn't be here." He moved quickly, walking from room to room, pausing now and then to run his hand along the walls. I didn't ask what he was doing. I didn't need to. He knew. In the bedroom, he stopped at the corner where my bed had been positioned. He knelt down, his fingers brushing against the floorboards. A low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated from beneath the floor, and I could feel it too. My heart skipped in my chest. "The crawl spaces," he said softly, almost as though speaking to himself. "There are hidden places within these walls. Something's been hidden here for a long time." I watched as he moved to the far wall, his fingers tapping lightly. With a barely audible grunt, he knelt to inspect the baseboards. "There," he muttered. "I found them." He pulled a loose panel away from the wall, revealing a narrow crawl space. It was dark inside, the air stale and thick. Without hesitation, Father Ruiz reached in, pulling out an old dusty bundle. I gasped as he uncovered it. A child's shoe, worn and frayed, as well as something else. A photograph. The photo was old, its edges curled and yellowed with time. It depicted a man, grinning widely. His eyes were black holes, empty, and something about the way he smiled made my stomach turn. There was a malevolence in his expression, something that wasn't right. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. That, Father Ruiz said, holding the photo up to the light, is the source of the problem. This man, he's tied to this place, and to Lillian. He's been waiting here, hidden in the walls, feeding off the energy. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as the implications of his words sank in. Whatever had tormented Lillian had been watching me too. Father Ruiz stood up, turning to face me. It's not enough just to remove the physical remnants. I'll bless the apartment. I'll remove the curse, but you need to move on, Maya. This place, this apartment, it's tied to something darker than you realize. You've been living in the presence of an entity that's been here far longer than you. That night, Father Ruiz performed the ritual. I don't know what exactly he did, but it felt like a weight was lifted from my shoulders. The air changed. Lighter, clearer. I had never believed in the supernatural before, but whatever happened that night, it worked. The next morning, I checked the apartment. There were no whispers, no knocks, no feeling of being watched. The apartment felt empty, but in a way that was peaceful. The oppressive energy was gone. But even now, a year later, I still triple-check the locks. I still hear the old pipes rattle in the walls. And sometimes in the stillness of the night, I swear I can hear someone laughing, just beyond the threshold of my hearing. The Holloway Arms was condemned in 2020, but the memories linger. Urban explorers have broken in, searching for a thrill, but the few who have dared report footsteps pacing Unit 4B. And one photograph, taken in the dim light of the abandoned building, captured a new black stain on the bathroom floor, one that wasn't there before, and it's spreading. I still don't know what it was that haunted me, what it was that had been lurking in the walls, but if you ever find yourself near the Holloway Arms and the wind carries the sound of 3 knocks, you might want to turn away, or knock 3 times yourself. See what happens. It's funny how quickly you can forget things when you're forced to move on. The mind is a funny thing, really. It adapts, forgets, and compartmentalizes things that are too difficult to deal with. I thought I would be able to forget everything. The whispers, the knocking, the presence that had lingered in the walls of the Holloway Arms. But as much as I wanted to convince myself it was all behind me, I never truly could. The memories followed. Me in small ways in the echoes of old apartment buildings, the strange sensation of being watched, the little creaks in the night that always seemed a little too deliberate. A few months after Father Ruiz performed the ritual and I left, the Holloway Arms was condemned. The city said it was due to structural instability and the decrepit state of the building, maybe even some sort of unreported structural damage, but I couldn't help but wonder if there was something else at play. I saw the notice taped to the door when I passed by the building on my way to work one morning and my heart sank. I hadn't thought about the Holloway Arms for months, but when I saw that, it was like the air around me changed. I didn't go back there after that. I didn't need to. The place was sealed up, boarded up, a decaying relic of the past. But then I started hearing stories. Whispers from urban explorers who had broken into the condemned building. They spoke of footsteps echoing in the halls, pacing relentlessly as if the place had been forgotten but not empty. One of them even took a photograph that went viral, showing the dark stain in the bathroom that hadn't been there before. It was slowly spreading, growing larger with each new image. When I saw the picture online, my stomach dropped. I recognized that bathroom, the dark, almost oily stain spreading across the floor. It was unmistakable. But it wasn't just that photograph. It was the look on the person's face who had taken it. The fear. They were looking at something. Just beyond the camera, their eyes wide in terror. I felt a sharp pang of guilt. I had thought I'd escaped. I had thought that after Father Ruiz's blessing, I was free of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the apartment, the building, had never let go. It was still there, waiting for someone else to take Lillian's place. It wasn't just about me. It was about the place itself. The Holloway Arms had a history, a dark one that had been festering beneath the surface long before Lillian Graves ever stepped inside. My mind kept returning to her. Lillian. The way she had been driven to madness by the whispers and the knocks. how the building had eventually claimed her. I thought about the child's shoe in the photograph of the eyeless man that Father Ruiz had found. What had happened to her was not an isolated incident. The energy that clung to that place had been passed down, and in the end, I hadn't escaped it at all. I don't know what happened after the condemnation. I never went back, not even once. The building is still there, though. You can find it on maps, on old listings for cheap apartments. People still wander past it, some stopping to take pictures, some brave enough to sneak in and explore the abandoned hallways. But every time I see it mentioned online or hear about it from someone else, my chest tightens, and I remember the cold, the whispers, and the feeling of someone watching me from behind the walls. And the knocks. It's been almost a year now since I left that apartment. The nightmares stopped for a while, but they've started coming back little by little. They're not the same, but the feeling is the same. I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced someone is standing at the foot of my bed waiting for me to wake up. I've never told anyone this, but sometimes, when the apartment gets too quiet, I swear I can hear something. Just a soft tapping echoing in the walls like the familiar 3 knocks from inside the closet. I still triple-check the locks every night before I go to sleep. I keep the lights on in the hallway. And when I hear a creak in the building, whether it's my current apartment or any other, it's impossible not to flinch. I tell myself it's nothing, just an old building settling, but deep down I know it's more than that. It always will be. I don't know if I'll ever truly escape it. Maybe that's the worst part. Maybe it's not just the building that's haunted. It's me. I'll never really be free from the whispers, the shadows in the corners of my mind. And when I see that stain in the bathroom in the pictures, that old photograph of the eyeless man, when I hear that laugh on the wind, I know I haven't escaped, not really. The Holloway arm still waits.